So many years ago, my parents still lived in the house that I grew up in as a child. The neighbors, Mr. and Mrs. Morse, stuck out to me as a kid as a regimental, stern couple. Now, Mr. Morris was the type of man you can only describe as blustering, and Mrs. Morris was sort of like a human square, with a bowl haircut and a mustache almost as bushy as her husband. Now, if this sounds like being uncharitable to them, hell yeah, I definitely am, and you'll hate these two by the end of the story as well. Unless you're a psychopath, in which case, may I suggest that you live in a cabin in the woods without neighbors. The Morrises were sternly friendly with my parents, while me and my siblings grew up. They had this son, August, who was in the Scouts with my elderly brother Barry, and he was sort of like a mini version of his father. Bossy, always demanding to be the leader of the activities, and would become quietly red-faced angry if things didn't go his way. Us kids in the neighborhood had a nickname behind his back, and that of a certain Austrian dictator that I don't think you're allowed to say on YouTube, but let's just say that he's someone that you will not see very often. Now anyway, the son isn't the point here. He was sent off to military boarding school at some point during high school, and the wild thing is that he bragged about asking to be sent there. And so we just grew up around the Morrises, who were pretty stern but polite and mostly just sort of kept to themselves. Occasionally they'd complain if our music was too loud or if we had a barbecue that ran past 9 p.m. And if any of mine or my siblings' balls went into the neighbor's garden or over the boundary hedge, well, you could kiss that goodbye. They would return it, but they would puncture it. My dad asked them why they did this once, and they claimed that the balls always hit some sharp object in their garden, and there was nothing they could do about it. What, was their garden made of spiked pits or something? Now, eventually my brother Barry moved out for college, and then a couple of years later so did I, and then a couple of years after that, Andy moved out to go traveling. And that just left my parents and our much, much younger sibling Sammy, who was only 10 when I was 20. Now one day, my mom FaceTimed me in tears telling me that they were being taken to court by the Morrises. And when I got her to calm down and Dad joined the call, they explained that they'd received a legal letter from the neighbors explaining that our boundary hedge had been encroaching on their land for years, and that my family owed them over $400,000 in reparations for lost revenue for use of the land as expansion for an unspecified business. Now, the reason they called me first was because I was studying law at the time. Immediately, this rang a million alarm bells in my head, and I asked them what distance the hedge was supposedly encroaching on the neighbor's land, and they very meekly told me 1 inch. And I asked them to scan the letter and send it over. I did some research, called a few friends, and discovered that, much as I suspected, the law firm representing the Morrises not only was not reputable, but in fact, entirely imaginary. The Morrises had invented their own law firm and sent a fake threatening letter. And my biggest confusion was why. It was obvious that my parents wouldn't just pay $400,000 without seeking legal counsel. And the answer came a couple of days later when a second letter from the fraudulent law firm arrived. They presented an offer that the bill would be dropped if my parents would agree to shift the boundary hedge 10 feet back, granting a much larger boundary to the neighbors as a sort of cost-free compensation to avoid any monetary demands. Now, this was something that, knowing my parents, if they didn't have a daughter who was a lawyer in training, they may have agreed to that just for a quiet life. Now, I worked it out using some land blueprints and contacted the relevant offices and discovered that the Morrises had applied for an extension to their house and purchased a prefab guest house, but both projects would require them to encroach into my parents' land. And so at the time, I happened to be dating an older guy, who's now my husband, who worked for a law firm specializing in this kind of thing. And he did some digging and checked out some old records, and it turned out that the boundary hedge was in fact around a foot into my parents' property, meaning if anything, the Morrises had been encroaching on our land this entire time. My boyfriend drafted an actual legitimate legal document stating this with the relevant proof, and the letter ended with a confirmation that my family was simply letting things be as long as the Morrises did the same to avoid any kind of escalation. We hoped that being caught red-handed would cause these fools to drop their lies. Clearly, we underestimated just how badly they wanted their extension, or how much money they dropped on this back garden prefab, presumably non-refundable. However, their next move didn't take the form of fake lawyers or legal threats at all. Instead, my parents started receiving notes written like ransom letters, with the letters cut out of various magazines. I'm not joking. They made strange, bizarre threats, such as a promise to kill our pet miniature donkey, something we never even owned, and another letter threatened to poison the koi in our pond. We don't have a pond or koi. The letters were so ridiculous that my parents kept copies, but didn't report them to the police, not at first. But then they became threatening. My parents wouldn't show me the notes directly, but they let slip that the notes names myself and my brothers, and then finally, a note arrived promising that Sammy would never arrive home from school one day when they least expected it, which is when they finally went to the cops. And of course, the cops couldn't prove that the notes came from the Morrises. This harassment went on for 5 years. Acts of petty vandalism, weird pieces of graffiti on the walls of the house, hoses were clipped in the middle of the night with the faucet running so the yard flooded, dead birds and roadkill being left on the doorstep, and the Morrises, these clever idiots, obviously made themselves the victims of their own harassment too, so suspicion didn't fall on them. And then the fires started. Just small, contained fires in the backyard that scorched the lawn. Another classic was that the Morrises would play classical music at full volume at 3:33 a.m. in the morning every single Wednesday, and when it was time for Sammy's exams, they escalated it to every day. My parents filed noise complaints, but the Morrises denied any involvement and, in fact, claimed that they hated classical music, and when investigators were there, somehow they mysteriously managed to know and the music didn't play on those nights. My eldest brother moved home and, in no uncertain terms, threatened the Morrises. The C words had the gall to call the cops on him, and this further undermined our claims against them. They went so far as to try and suggest that my brother was the one committing the vandalism, despite the fact that he'd been living in a totally different state during most of the incidents and had an alibi for most of it. Now Sammy, meanwhile, was becoming an absolute wreck, and we all felt so hopeless, and it felt like the whole world was against us. In the end, the entire family got together for a family meeting, and we very tearfully decided that the only recourse that we had was to move out of our family home that had been in the family since my mom's childhood. So that's what we did. We put the house up for sale, my parents accepted the first offer they received, and they moved into a smaller house that, realistically, was more manageable for them, especially once Sammy went away to college. There's no happy ending here, really, at least not for us. The lesson is simply that sometimes it's better to walk away than let your entire life be taken up with fighting the fight, even if it is a just and good one. There is an ending, though, but I can't say it's a good one, and as much as I hated the Morrises for what they put us through, I wouldn't wish this on anyone. Remember their son, who willingly went to military school and we nicknamed that Austrian painter? Well, it turns out that Augie had been thrown out of military school, then dishonorably discharged from the military, all without his parents' knowledge. He'd fallen into drugs and violence, and one day, he came home. Augie held his parents at gunpoint with a sawed-off shotgun, zip-tied them back-to-back to dining chairs, and then he and a couple of associates robbed the Morrises of every valuable they could get their hands on, and then, as a parting gift, with the butt of that sawed-off, he shattered both of his father's kneecaps. Nobody knows what caused Augie to hate his parents so much. It's probably not hard to guess, but when he was caught, he kept quiet. And he was caught a few days later as he admitted to what he'd done, but not why he'd done it. He was sent to prison for quite a few years, and Mrs. Morris died shortly after, poetically said to have died of a broken heart. Mr. Morris spent the rest of his years in a hospice, unable to walk, and also never uttered a single word again since that night. And so the new neighbors who bought our family home never had to deal with the neighbors from hell, and the whole story is a reminder of just how completely messed up and pointless the motivations of some people can be, how they can live with themselves when they all cause so much pain, and how when you cause pain to others, sometimes it returns to you tenfold. I don't know if I believe in karma, but in this case, I can't help but feel that no matter how much the Morrises screwed with my family, they got far more than they deserved, and I can only hope their son, Augie, can one day find some peace. Long-time listener, first-time writers, they say, and this happened about a year ago, and holy F. I never thought something this messed up would happen to me and my family. So it all started when my parents, both recently retired, decided to use their part of their life savings to go away on a 6-month world cruise. Not really my jam, but they were psyched about it and I was psyched for them. And even better, the lease on my apartment was up the week before they left, so I was free to house sit for them the entire time they were gone. This was a relief to my mom, who would have spent the whole cruise in a state of neurosis, calling me or my brother to check on the house every 5 minutes. And knowing that I was living there ironically meant that she wouldn't worry at all. Oh, Mother, if only you'd known. In the week before they left, as I moved my things into my old childhood bedroom ready for the next 6 months, my mom gave me the rundown of the house as if I hadn't grown up there. I barely paid attention to all the things that she was telling me. Yes, Mom, I know where the fridge is, I know the Wi-Fi password, I know how to use the TV. I know the guest room is filled with Aunt Joni's art while she's between husbands, and that I must not dispose of any of it. What I didn't know about, though, was the new neighbor. His name was Mr. Samuels, and he moved in a few months previously. If you believe my mom, Mr. Samuels was an angel sent from heaven. He was the loveliest, sweetest old person, Mom said, despite the fact that he was only a couple of years older than my dad. Now, he baked cakes for the neighbors, so I shouldn't be surprised if he dropped by with some muffins or maybe even some red velvet cake. I admit, I do like a good red velvet cake, so maybe Mr. Samuels was okay by me. Mr. Samuels had a nurse who came by every other day, so I didn't need to worry about him apparently, not that I'd been planning to. Mom did enough worrying for the whole family. I didn't actually see Mr. Samuels before my parents left for their cruise because he was away staying with one of his kids. And so I bid my parents farewell at the docks, waving a handkerchief and sobbing like a wartime bride. Not really, but then headed back to the house, ready for 6 months of hardcore freelance art commissions and watching all the subscription services that my parents subscribed to and I didn't want to pay for. Mr. Samuels returned home a few days into my newfound alone time, and imagine my absolute surprise when the gentle Mr. Rogers-esque fella that I pictured was absolutely nothing like that at all. Mr. Samuels may have been 75 years old, but he was the kind of 75 that looked ex-Navy SEAL, and in fact was, and who probably had a home gym, and he did, and he was a muscular, confidently spoken, weirdly charming man, and at first I wondered why he needed a regular nurse, and then when I first saw the nurse show up for his first appointment, I remember that my mother can be rather naive sometimes. Let's just say that she was the kind of nurse who is paid good money to relieve someone's tension via massage, and just leave it at that. But hey, the man was single, and just because he was old, it didn't mean that he didn't have needs. And every other day at 75? Damn, I was almost in awe. Now, he did bake a very good red velvet cake, and one of his first acts as a welcome gift was to bring a cake over and introduce himself. I'll admit, while he was charming, he also made my skin crawl. I'm a 32-year-old woman, and this 75-year-old man, who looked like he could easily overpower me without a moment's thought, was very clearly trying to rizz me up, as the kids say. And I usually hate the phrase undressing me with his eyes, but there was no better way to describe it here. And Mr. Samuels made no secret of it. He'd make remarks like, Gladys never said her daughter was so cute, or how he'd wish that he'd known my mom when she was my age, things like that. It would have been flattering if it wasn't so intense, and he wasn't quite so, I don't know how to describe it, but he had this aura where it was obvious that he wanted me to know that he could take me. And I've known guys like this since high school, but never once was he ever twice my age. And he wasn't so much a silver fox as a white wolf, and once I got that image in my head, I couldn't shake it. Thankfully, I didn't have many dealings with Mr. Samuels outside of him bringing over baked goods, and in the end, as much as it hurts me to have to do so, I ended up tossing them out because I was becoming paranoid that he might be slipping something into the baking. I'd watched an Instagram short about a predator who did some fairly gross stuff like that, and I got it inside my own head about it a little. Looking back, I am pretty grateful that I didn't risk it. And so after a month of catching up on art commissions and emailing editors begging for work, I began to go a little stir-crazy. Surprisingly, Mom didn't call anywhere near as much as I expected, and I found myself missing my goofy parents a lot. We had a few Zoom calls, but the internet on the cruise ship wasn't exactly reliable, and so half of the time it was like watching my folks in stop motion while Mom yelled, "What was that? What did you say, Sel?" over and over, as my name is Celeste, but she calls me Sel. I decided to surprise my parents by giving the house a little bit of a decluttering, or at least the parts that I knew that I was allowed to touch. Aunt Joni's paintings could stay, but I knew that the attic was an absolute crap show of disorganization. Plus, I figured that I'd find a bunch of fun childhood memories up there, and maybe some stuff that was worth a bit of money. I remember my brother having a bunch of old consoles and action figures that surely had to be worth something, and God knows that we both could have used the money since we were both artists. I wasn't in the attic for long before I came to two realizations. One, this was going to be a mammoth job, and two, someone had cut a hole in the drywall between our attic and the adjoining one. And of course, it was Mr. Samuel's attic. Not only that, cables were snaking through the hole, followed them through the maze of boxes and old Christmas decorations, and I was horrified at what I found. Holes had been drilled into the floor, very recently by the look of the sawdust, and two wires snaked down into two rooms. Now, without going into technical details, I traced the wires to the bathroom and the bedroom that I was staying in and discovered that small cameras had been set up, hidden within fake smoke alarms. Now, following the wires back up and creeping into Mr. Samuel's attic, I found a laptop running with active feeds of both rooms. The bedroom camera was angled so you could see the whole room, and the bathroom camera was angled at the shower. And so in short, dear sweet old Mr. Samuels had literally been spying on me for God knows how long and had violated my privacy in the most diabolically disgusting way. I minimized the live feed and found a folder on the desktop marked quote-unquote best of. The contents horrified me. There were a number of videos of me showering, of me changing, and even a couple of where I was, for want of a better term, relieved some tension of being single in bed. Now, without thinking, in utter disgust, I deleted the entire folder and emptied the recycle bin, and then immediately realized the idiotic move I'd made. Subconsciously, though, I think my brain drove me to do so in order to avoid considering law enforcement, and more on that later. I wanted revenge on Samuels, but I also wanted him to live with fear of the revenge. Now, my first step was to sever the wires connecting the cameras. My second step was to head downstairs and reach out to a friend of mine who was, how do I put this, good with computers. He sent me a piece of software to install on Mr. Samuel's computer via a USB stick that would completely mess up not only his laptop, but any computer connected to the same router, irreparably, my friend promised. Now, I should add here that I knew Samuels was out of town for a few days, supposedly visiting his daughters again. Now, who knows what he really got up to? It could have been literally anything, and he was due back the next day, so I hurried and installed the virus on his laptop via that USB stick. I followed my friend's instructions and then forced myself to leave the attic and wait a day or so for Mr. Samuels to return. And I could tell when he discovered the outcome of his deception. From his laptop speaker, a robotic voice began blaring, "I'm a voyeur pervert and I also have kids," over and over again. Above me, I could hear Samuels freaking out until he slammed that laptop shut. Then I heard his footsteps thundering down the stairs, presumably to his other main PC, and I waited and then, "I'm a voyeur pervert and I also have kids." According to my friend, there was absolutely no way to get rid of this unless you were a tech genius or whatever. Something about writing it to the root of the BIOS or something, so even a hard drive wipe and Windows reinstall wouldn't fix it. And something told me that while Mr. Samuels might be capable of setting up a pervert spy network, he wasn't capable of fixing this. I was right, because the next weekend, I saw his entire desktop PC smashed into little bits sitting out on the sidewalk for the garbage collection. Hilariously, they wouldn't take electronics, so it was just sort of left there until the HOA contacted him about the unsightly garbage, and the next day, a snapped laptop joined the pile. Now, I'm sure he suspected me because the baking delivery stopped, and he also avoided eye contact with me whenever we'd pass each other coming and going. Now, I still felt sick that this dirty, disgusting old perv had gotten away with getting off to me at my most vulnerable, though. I kept consoling myself with the reminder that he was 75 and would be dead long before me. But then I had nightmares about how he might have sent the videos to other like-minded perverts. No matter how much I reminded myself that the low-quality, grainy pictures made my identity impossible to discern, it didn't help because Samuels could easily have doxed me. I live in fear of something else happening, but nothing else did. I confessed my fears to my friend, though, who suggested one final idea. I don't know exactly what he did, but a few days later, a smartphone arrived in the mail. My friend told me to stick it through Samuel's mailbox in the middle of the night and just leave it at that. And I asked him why and what the phone contained, but he told me it was better that I didn't know. I posted the phone. Whatever was on there had caused Samuels to become a recluse, and the rest of my house sitting went without incident. And after a while, I noticed that the nurse was no longer coming to visit Samuels. Good. And that man didn't deserve any joy in his life. And eventually my parents returned from their cruise. I didn't tell them anything about what had happened. I was honestly just too ashamed, and too worried that my dad, the mild-mannered as he was usually, would spend his remaining years in prison for killing their next-door neighbor if he knew what he'd done to his baby girl. Now, a few months after I moved out into my own place again, Mom mentioned that Mr. Samuels had been placed into an assisted living facility by his children. She said it was all very strange, like he mentally declined within the space of a year. Now, I said nothing, but I had to suppress a smile there. I don't know if I did the right thing by not calling the cops and handling everything in this very unusual way, but here's the reason. When I was in college, I was assaulted. My experience with the police was, well, as I'm sure some of you know, not so good. And I was made to feel like it was all my fault because of how I dressed and because I'd had maybe 2 drinks, because I'd been affectionate with my assailant. I know all cops aren't like that. I know that plenty of cops are sympathetic, even heroic with certain victims, but I was not one of them. And the idea of trying to convince them that my elderly neighbor was spying on me, even though realistically the evidence was all there, it just terrified me. And so maybe I handled things pretty badly. Maybe me and my friend taking justice into our own hands was an immoral decision. But honestly, knowing what that man was capable of in his 70s, I can only imagine the things that he may have done when he was younger, fitter, and more savvy at getting away with it. And knowing he's spending the last years of his life slowly losing his mind in an assisted living facility, probably being spoon-fed baby food by a tattooed male orderly who he can't sexually harass, well, honestly, I sleep at night just fine. I do still periodically check for spy cams, though, as I'm quite paranoid and you can never be too careful. Do any of you have someone who you'll never forget, even though you never really knew them that well? Someone who was a constant in your life, just sort of a background character who isn't around anymore. Someone you find your mind drifting back to every now and then because even though you didn't know them that much, you just saw them all the time and they were like an interactive, friendly part of the furniture. Now, I don't mean that in a derogatory way. It's like a beloved lazy boy that you get from Goodwill. You don't know its backstory and you never will, and you don't ask about its past and it doesn't ask about yours. Christ, this sounds dehumanizing, but it's how I think about it. It's in a fond, loving way, trust me, and I hope one day I'm someone else's Goodwill lazy boy, someone who touched a person's life just by being there and someone they'll always remember. Now, I remember Mr. Browning. I'll never forget him, and even though the last time I saw him was probably 1985, I think I remember him fondly regardless of how things ended. Now, I sure know that I always thought fondly whenever this guy crossed my mind. Me and the wife often talked about how we should invite him over for dinner. We wondered if he was lonely after his wife had passed a decade or so before, and we wondered if his adult kids called often because they never seemed to visit. But we just never got around to asking Mr. Browning. Hell, I don't even remember what his Christian name was. It was always, "Good morning, Mr. Browning," and he'd respond with, "Good morning, Ted." He was my elder. We understood the hierarchy, and I do know that he was a former teacher, so maybe he thought of himself as Mr. Browning. Maybe it didn't even cross his mind to ask me to call him by his first name. Amos, That was it, Amos Browning, and I remember from his obituary and later the funeral. And I think those were the only times that I heard his first name spoken and one of the only times that I saw his adult children. His son was a very doughy-faced man who looked bored to be at his father's funeral. His daughter was one of those sharp-faced women with a meek, sycophantic husband and the kind of bratty son who wanted to be the center of attention, even at Grandpa's wake. We didn't stay long. We'd gone to pay our tributes to Mr. Browning, but we couldn't stay. We didn't want his family asking us questions about his death, and they likely knew that I'd been present when it happened, and I'm not a good liar. I would have struggled to give them the answers they wanted instead of the horrible, haunting, traumatizing truth. Me and Mr. Browning used to chat over the fence. Well, I'd lean over the fence, and he'd mow the lawn, and he was always mowing his lawn. He had one of those old push mowers, an electric one, and I just kept trying to persuade him to buy a ride on, but he said his yard was way too small for that. It wasn't, and besides, at his age, probably early 70s, it was a great way to get some exercise and a little peace and quiet. Peace and quiet from who, I'm not really sure, since he lived alone after his wife had passed before me and my family moved in, but that's what he said. We'd talk, a lot, but never really get to know each other, you know. We talked about the Detroit Lions a bunch. He was a die-hard supporter, and I was just a pretty casual one. And we talked about the weather, we talked about politics, but never too seriously, and sometimes we'd watch the same shows at the same time, and we'd talk about those too. We both loved Miles Davis and The Who and Kiss, and he told me about his first ever concert, sneaking in to watch Kiss play, but I was never sure if he was telling the truth or just recounting the plot of that one movie where that exact thing happens. It was a fun story anyhow, even if he told me about 5 times, and occasionally he'd ask about my wife and how she was doing and how her job was going, but I think he wanted to talk about his wife in exchange but couldn't bring himself to do so, apart from that one time. Sometimes my wife would bring him a lasagna or some other baked goods, and he'd thank her like a perfect gentleman, and he always handed the dishes back to me over the fence, never once brought them to our door, always over the fence. Now, I chatted to him so much that by the time we moved out, there was a groove in the ground where grass had stopped growing in the place where I'd always stood to talk to Mr. Browning. Now, I remember exactly what we were talking about on the day it happened. My wife had just had a minor operation to remove a benign cyst from her breast, and he was asking how she was doing. I told him she was doing fine and would be home from the hospital the next day or even that evening if things went well. Mr. Browning looked at me then as he was mowing the lawn and then told me that I was lucky and I should hold on to a good woman like that. And then he said, and I'll never forget it, not least because they were his last words, he said, "I miss her so much." And then he sort of looked down, away like he was about to hide tears, but I saw a look of alarm and then fear cross his face. Maybe I'm just imagining, but I swear that I saw him try and stop the forward motion of the mower as he pushed forward. I'm not sure how it happened. He was always so careful, running the electrical extension cable around the edge of the lawn, making sure that he was mowing nowhere near it, being careful like it was muscle memory. But I heard the crunch and whir of the motor running over the electrical socket and the cable. I don't know how or why, but there was no grounding. The mower's rubber handles just sort of weren't there anymore, and the live electrical cables got tangled into the motor blades, mangling and electrifying the mower as Mr. Browning held onto it. And hold onto it he did. I watched in abject frozen horror as his body began to convulse, as smoke rose up from his hands where he was gripping the metal handle. I could smell the cooking flesh and electrical burn. I watched as the grass around him singed and blackened, and I knew I had to knock him away from the mower but couldn't touch him myself. I searched for something, anything that I could safely use to shove him off the mower. My eyes settled on my old wooden baseball bat, but by the time I'd hauled myself over that fence, I knew it was too late. Mr. Browning had collapsed to the ground, finally letting go of the lawnmower, and I knew that there was no saving him, so I ran over to the outlet and switched off the electricity. Then I went back over to my neighbor, my friend who I knew so little about, and he was blackened and charred. His face was horrific. His eyeballs had somehow survived the electrocution, and they stared white and frozen out of a face that looked like it had been sucked clean from the inside. One detail I remember, one grim detail, is how his mouth was open and how I realized that he had false teeth because they had fallen down into his throat. I ran into his house and called 911, and the rest was a blur of paramedics and police and being questioned. And at first, when his daughter got there, she seemed to somehow blame me for her father's death, as if she'd ever given a crap about him in life. He may not have opened up to me, but Mr. Browning certainly made it clear that his kids did not play a big part in his life. And so fast forward to the funeral, the son gave a eulogy, and it was like he barely knew his father any better than I did. It made me so sad and devastated that this man who seemed like nothing but a nice, amicable gentleman could have been so forgotten and discarded, except for the neighbor who gave him some friendly, superficial banter over the fence, the same neighbor who was forced to watch him die. I swore then that when I had a kid, I would do everything I could to make sure that they wanted me in their life forever. And as it turned out, my wife was unknowingly pregnant at the time of that funeral. We had a son and then later 2 daughters, and they were the loves of my life. They're all grown themselves now with families of their own, and my wife and I are grandparents, and we make sure to keep our family close, regular meals together, Christmas and Thanksgiving being particularly huge affairs. Now, maybe Mr. Browning hadn't been a great father. It's not for me to judge his kids for distancing themselves from him. I don't judge them for their relationship with their father. It just sort of makes me sad. But before the sadness came the trauma. We bought our home with the intention of starting a family there, but every time I so much as stepped foot in the backyard, I was met with flashbacks of Mr. Browning cooking alive. I could smell that electric burn and see those bulging dead eyes. We made a loss selling, but we moved, and my son was born in a smaller house, but it was one filled with love and closeness, and I was no longer haunted by the sight of my neighbor's final moments, at least not directly. Like I said, I'll always remember Mr. Browning, and part of that means being cursed with remembering how I played witness to his demise. Evening, let's read. I'm a normal, regular-ass guy with a wife and kid. I lead a quiet life, I work in a bank, and I'm the last person to get involved in drama or scary situations or anything that you might want to hear about on your channel. At least, that's how I've always wanted to live my life anyway. Sometimes you don't have a choice, and that lack of choice doesn't come from your own actions, but from those around you. In my case, it was a house, and even before all of this happened, we used to call it the Nightmare House. We, being me and the other neighbors who were mostly friends, we do safari suppers, quiz nights at the local bar, all sorts of stuff like that, and apart from a handful of residents who had good reason, everyone got involved, and it was a nice, friendly community. And then there was the house next door to mine. The owner never joined us for events or hung out, and he never attended street parties or barbecues or singing carols during Christmas. Not because he was antisocial, but because we never once even met him. He'd never lived in the house, not since any of us could remember. Old Mr. Peterson said he could vaguely remember the owner from when he'd first bought the property a few decades back, but since then, nothing. And for whatever reason, this guy had bought the house and then just screwed off to South Africa or some such place and just left the property to gradually fall into ruin. And there must have been a caretaker at some point because ever since any of us could remember, all the windows were boarded up and the doors were sealed with planks, but beyond that, it was clear that nobody cared for the property. The yards front and back were both overgrown and almost jungle-like, and the neighbors sometimes considered trying to maintain the outside a little, but good God. We all had our own lives and properties, and it wasn't like we were some uptight homeowners association. It was just kind of annoying to have this eyesore right in the middle of our normal suburban neighborhood. We kind of joked around about the owner, like he was a vampire who lived in the basement and the abandonment was some ruse or gallows humor and he died years ago and nobody noticed. And this joke kind of weighed on us, and one of the neighbors contacted the district for, I don't know, some kind of international wellness check. Now, we were assured that the owner was perfectly fine and living abroad and had every right to leave his property the way it was, as long as it wasn't in danger of collapsing or causing a safety hazard. And then the graffiti started, and we knew that it was a few of the neighborhood kids letting off some steam, including, I suspected, my own 15-year-old son, and so none of us really did anything about it. But slowly and surely, the building started to get tagged, scribbled at first, and then some genuinely kind of impressive artwork. And it was better than the squat brick monstrosity with the boarded-up windows, I guess. One piece was a parody of that British artist Banksy, and I am absolutely certain that one was my son because he'd conveniently been asking me about Banksy a few weeks before the art appeared. And so yeah, we called it the Nightmare House, but it was all in good fun, and if the owner cared about the graffiti or the yard turning into the Amazon, then he certainly never let that on. And for all I know, there was nobody in the vicinity who was even in touch with him, and he simply didn't know or care. Why he bought the house and left it to rot was anyone's guess. I know the answer now, but that can wait until the end of the story. We first noticed that something was up with the Nightmare House when one day, the boards over the front door disappeared. That was all, nothing more, just that. Murmurs spread through the neighborhood. Had the owner finally returned after his decades-long estrangement from his poop hole of a house? Had he employed a caretaker? Had he sold the property? Sadly, none of the answers were this positive, as we'd soon learn. Squatters had moved in. And looking back, it's wild that this hadn't happened before now. The place was rife for squatting, and yet it had remained untouched. Not anymore, though. A few of us kept watch. Yeah, I know this makes us sound like curtain-twitching Karens, but some of us had young kids and we wanted to know what kind of squatters we were dealing with here. And we counted 4 regulars who clearly lived there and a bunch of others who came and went. And it was pretty obvious from the get-go that these weren't student squatters or struggling homeless people who just wanted a warm place for the night. One of the guys, the leader I would call them, was bald and covered in tattoos. He had about 5 visible teeth, and when he was shirtless, which was often, you could see vicious purple track marks running up and down his forearms. And he wasn't the kind of addict that you could feel sorry for, though. This guy was nasty. If he saw one of us even glancing in his direction, he'd hiss and let loose a torrent of abuse. He really wanted to establish the fact that this was his neighborhood now, and none of us better F with him. The other squatters called him Crunk. What a name, though. And then there was Blippo and F-Jockey. Not exactly how that name went. Then there was Blippo and F-Jockey. Not exactly sure how that name went. And they were almost as bad as him. F-Jockey was missing a leg just below the knee, and sometimes he'd hobble around on a rusty prosthetic, and other times he'd traverse the broken pathways of the Nightmare House in a cranky old wheelchair, and I'm amazed that thing even really moved. And finally there was Finlay, who was the least worst of the 4. He'd at least occasionally offer mumbled apologies to the neighbors, while sort of skulking around wearing the same gray hoodie that he always wore. And he also clearly never washed it because you could smell him coming a mile off or smell where he'd been. And this is why I say that he was the least worst rather than a good guy, because when the thefts started, the crime scenes often reeked of Finlay, and he was the smallest and thinnest of the squatters, and we were certain that he was the one sneaking into neighbors' houses and stealing food and essentials. Never anything valuable, nothing that could cause too much of a rage, but someone was stealing our bread and our Twinkies, our detergent, that kind of stuff. And of course he somehow managed to slip in and out unnoticed without violently breaking and entering, and so whenever we reported these thefts to the cops, it sounded kind of pathetic. "Oh hey, officer, yeah, someone stole a bunch of bananas from the counter," or "Excuse me, detective, but our mop's gone missing and I can smell the aftermath of some homeless man." What we did try doing was reporting the squatters to the authorities, but apparently there are laws and protections for squatters, particularly ones that require the property's owner to make the report themselves. The cops told us that the owner wouldn't even respond to them about it, and he was almost impossible to track down in whichever foreign country he lived in anyway, so for all they could prove, the squatters were legitimate tenants. They weren't, of course, you could just tell, but without the owner actually confirming this or filing any kind of charges, they were free to come and go in their adopted home as they pleased. And they would do all sorts of stupid and creepy crap that gradually wore us down. My family, me, my wife, and my 2 kids were their direct neighbors, so we got the brunt of the hassle. And it started with dumb stuff, like connecting my garden hose to an outdoor faucet, and then swiping the hose and using it to fill their outdoor pool. And this was during a time when using hoses was banned, so I only found out about this when I received a letter warning me about my property's water usage. And even though I couldn't prove for sure that it was the squatters, but the hose had been left right by the fence and they mysteriously had a full pool in their back garden. Not a actual one or anything, it was like a large kiddie pool, but still. Now one time I did catch them. They'd connected an extension cord to our outdoor electricity outlet and snaked it over the fence to plug in what appeared to be an in-progress stereo stack system like you'd find in the 80s. And it seemed like they were building some kind of outdoor sound system under a makeshift gazebo they'd erected. And in retrospect, I should have been more alarmed by what this implied, but I was too mad about the electrical theft. I just unplugged the extension cord, and despite my wife pleading for me to just let it go, I stormed next door. F-Jockey answered the door, laying it on heavy about how hard it had been for him to answer the door trying to play the victim, but I was having none of it. I demanded to speak to Crunk. F-Jockey told me to wait and then shut the door in my face. Now I could hear him yelling for Crunk inside and then heard Crunk's response, and he sounded pretty heavily high on whatever. And when he eventually came to the door, his eyes were bloodshot and he still had a rubber strap tied around his upper arm. To his credit, it was the first time that he'd ever been polite and amicable. He apologized very sincerely for stealing my electricity, but told me that he thought that I wouldn't mind because I seemed like such a nice, generous guy who clearly cared for his neighbors. And then he started going on about how we were all children of Gaia and how electricity was a tool of the man, and if we didn't share it and spread it around, then we were just doing what they wanted. It was nonsense, but the way he spoke and the cadence of his voice, there was something hypnotic about it. I somehow found myself agreeing to let him use my outdoor outlet, and as I walked away, I kind of realized how Charles Manson managed to get so many followers. Some people just have something about them, no matter how obnoxious and vile they seem to be, and Crunk was clearly one of these people. The more I thought about it, the more dangerous I realized he could potentially be. I knew that we either had to drive those squatters out or somehow integrate them into the community. At our next hangout with the neighborhood guys, we decided that we'd try the latter. We'd invite them to our next cookout and try and make them feel welcome. Maybe they could help. And I was the one hosting the neighborhood cookout, so they could just hop the fence and join us for burgers and beers. I didn't have the opportunity to invite them to the cookout, though, as the next day, I went to get the barbecue grill set up for the summer and give it the usual routine maintenance and a good clean. And to my surprise, the space it usually occupied on my back porch was just empty. It wasn't a tiny barbecue grill either. It was a good 4 feet wide, a decently expensive piece of kit. How they got it over the fence and into the Nightmare House's yard is beyond me even now. But steal it they did, which I confirmed by glancing over the fence and saw Crunk and the boys grilling burgers on my grill, which they hadn't cleaned, so it was giving off a bit of a stench. When Crunk saw me looking, he waved and gave me a whole, "Hey neighbor, want to come over for some patties?" Now I kind of just let out that it was my grill, and Crunk sort of beamed this wide, toothless smile and said, yeah, he knew. He thought he'd give it a trial run for me before barbecue season started actually. And that was, of course, that they'd clean it all up and return it unharmed when they were done with it. I just felt helpless. What the hell was I supposed to say? I felt positioned on a knife's edge, like everything was just about balanced right now, but a single nudge in my entire life would collapse straight into the blade. I don't know if I'm expressing just how intimidating it all was, but ever since they moved in, it was just these looks, these sneers, these snatches of overheard conversation that I couldn't prove were about me and the neighbors, but were definitely talking about how they'd mess things up for anyone who gave them a hassle. And Crunk had these eyes that had a sort of dead glint to them. Crazy eyes, just like Manson or any of those cult leader guys. Now maybe I'm just a pussy, but I genuinely felt like if I dared to fight back in any way, something terrible would befall me and my family. My cowardice changed that weekend, though. I'd been working late into the night, so I didn't get up until just past midday, and my wife was out at her job. My son was camping with some buddies, so I called for my daughter to say hi, but she was nowhere to be found. I brewed my morning, now afternoon, coffee and stepped into the yard for a little cigarette. I know, smoking will kill you. Don't start it, kids. Anyways, I could smell cooking meat and the pungent smell of my uncleaned grill, and I could hear music playing on the stereo system that the squatters had set up using my electricity. And I could hear voices. Crunk, F-Jockey, Blippo, Finlay, A couple of unfamiliar male voices, a few female voices, and then a very familiar voice sounding kind of unsure and nervous. It was my daughter. My now 16-year-old daughter somehow next door with these filthy squatters. And feeling like a kind of weirdo but not wanting to look like one, I looked over the fence. And there she was, in that weird kiddie pool that they'd filled using my hose. She was wearing a bikini, one that I'd had no idea she even owned, because if I had, I would have had severe words for her about wearing it out, considering it barely covered anything, and she was 16 for Christ's sakes. And there she was, in that pool with Crunk, who I could unfortunately see was completely naked, sidling up to my daughter and trying to persuade her to free herself and lose those clothes like the rest of them. And that's when I noticed the other 3 naked girls lounging around that yard. They looked older than my daughter, but only just, and there were a couple of guys, and F-Jockey and Blippo, all completely nude, sprawled out around the garden, eating these greasy burgers and smoking what I definitely could smell was pot. And how the hell they talked my daughter into going over there in just that scrap of a bikini, I'll never know. Following the event, she didn't want to talk about it, and I could tell that she was ashamed and scared, so I never really pushed her on it. All I know is that she implied that Crunk was incredibly persuasive, in exactly the way that I'd considered when I compared him to Charles Manson. A red mist overtook me. I grabbed the first weapon I had, a shovel, and managed to pull myself over the 6-foot-high fence and leap into the squatter's garden. With a blow that impressed even myself, I punctured that kiddie pool with the shovel and then pressed it up against Crunk's throat before anyone had a chance to react. I saw Blippo, the biggest of the guys, start to stand up, and I told him that if he moved a muscle, his buddy would be missing a head. And all the while, I noticed Finlay standing in the corner of the yard kind of shaking, looking like he was going through H withdrawals. Jesus Christ, what a life these people led. And Crunk raised his hands and started on about how I was freaking out over nothing, that I was being a controlling father, that my daughter was an adult in her own person and could do what she wanted. Now, at this point, I was shaking with rage and struggling not to deprive my kids of a father by committing first-degree murder. I told Crunk through these gritted teeth that my daughter was in fact not an adult and was a 16-year-old child. Meanwhile, my daughter was crying and begging me to forgive her, saying that she was sorry, begging me not to think less of her, things like that. It broke my heart, and I told her that I didn't judge her at all, but I couldn't look at her in the moment. Not that I wouldn't, but I was just too hesitant to take my eyes off of Crunk. I told my daughter to get out of the now deflated kiddie pool, grab a towel, and head back to our house now. Crunk had the absolute gall to moan that it was his towel and we couldn't steal it, and I responded by pressing the shovel, brand new and unblunted by lack of use, right against his stupid throat. And I think he knew I was serious. And then when I was sure that my daughter had left the backyard, I said, "I'm gonna go now." And I slowly backed away. As I was leaving, I left them with one final warning. I suggested that they find a new place to squat because my patience was at an end and I wouldn't be so forgiving next time. I said a bunch of other stuff too, like if they ever came near my daughter again it would be the end of them, and that they were no longer going to steal my crap, that kind of thing. And I swear to God, Crunk just smiled at me and said, "May the Lord bless and watch over you." And I remember shivering as I left their back gate and followed my daughter back to our house. For some reason, I didn't think that the Lord which Crunk referred to was the same Lord I worshipped in church most Sundays. And the squatters didn't move out. We had a neighborhood meeting in which we discussed potential ideas of getting rid of them. None of them were any good. They either involved violence or had no chance of working, and we all left feeling very dejected. But then a mysterious stranger solved the problem for us. One evening, all the squatters were out doing God knows what people like that do, and, at least from what I overheard them suspecting, a drug dealer they'd pissed off sent his goons around and firebombed that house with a couple of Molotov cocktails, or something. And the goons somehow got in through the backyard, hurled those cocktails through the back windows, which the squatters had removed the boards from sometime previously. By the time the fire department put the blaze out, the house was a charred husk. Nobody would be living there anytime soon, and no security camera captured footage of the culprits. No arrests were made, and no evidence was found. The squatters moved on, and the neighbors all celebrated their departure despite the scare of the fire. I celebrated too, but it was something that I kept to myself. I'd installed an outdoor security camera after the incident with my daughter, and it captured the neighboring property's yard, and I'd told the cops that I hadn't gotten around to setting it up yet, but that was a lie. You see, the camera didn't capture a bunch of drug dealer henchmen showing up to burn the place down. It captured a single figure, leaving my house in his beloved Nirvana hoodie, and it showed him vaulting over the fence and with shaking hands, throwing that Molotov into the property, and then it showed him climbing back over the fence and disappearing back into my house. My son and daughter are twins, and my son is incredibly protective over his sister, and we never spoke about the incident. After I viewed and deleted that footage, I spoke to my wife in front of my son and said that they are very lucky that the fire hadn't spread to our house, that the firebombers needed to be more responsible. Responsible, my wife asked and laughed. I just nodded and gave my son a look. One day, I'm going to have to talk with him. I'm going to have to tell him that he must never ever do anything as insane as that again, that violence isn't the answer, that no matter how sure he was that the squatters were all out, he couldn't be 100% sure. But not just yet. For now, I'm just still celebrating their departure and the return of the owner who, due to the structural damage, was able to have the property demolished. Now, for one final sting in the tail, the owner of the property joined us in the bar one night, and he apologized profusely for how things had played out. He explained that he grew up in that house as a foster child, and while he didn't go into detail, he told us that he suffered there, and he called it the Nightmare House, which caused us all to shoot each other a look. He explained that he'd grown up and put the past behind him and become a successful software engineer back when the internet was first taking off. And then, when he saw the house was up for sale in the market, he bought it with the intention of having it demolished then. But he was denied permission by the district for some reason or another, and instead he was left owning the property filled with this cancerous memory like an albatross around his neck. And so his way of getting revenge on the house was to let it rot, and again he apologized profusely for not considering the effect that would have on the rest of the neighborhood. But now, with the damage to the house, he'd finally been granted permission to have it knocked down and had decided that he was going to turn the land into a graffiti art area and a skate park, having seen photos of some of the graffiti before the squatters moved in. He ended the night by saying that he wished he could thank the arsonists and then looked around at all of us. Now, I'm sure he thought one of us had burned the place down, and honestly, even knowing a hint of the dark memories that place held for him, I'm not surprised that he was grateful that he could finally wake up from the nightmares of the Nightmare House. As for what became of those squatters, who knows? And frankly, after the crap they pulled, who cares? So recently, I moved into an apartment block in a pretty artsy area of a pretty artsy neighborhood. Now, I won't dox myself, but you can probably guess one of two places I mean, and it's not the New York one. I love this apartment building. It was more of a boarding house, really. Only 8 apartments and the top floor belonging to the building super. And all the neighbors were really friendly, and most of us were artists of some sort. And there was me, a painter, and then we had a singer, a couple of writers, 2 more painters, and a mixed media artist, and apparently a sculptor. The sculptor was the neighbor directly across from me. Nobody knew his name, or even if he definitely was a he. He just went by the moniker TTT, all capital. The rest of us would often have sort of group brainstorm evenings where we'd chat about art and set the world to rights, in the common room or TV room that we all shared on the ground floor. Triple T never joined us, of course, and soon the mysterious sculptor became the subject of fascination for a group of creatives with hefty imaginations and too much time on our hands, obviously. Nearly all of the theories about TTT's true identity were ridiculous. Most of them were supernatural, and one of the painters absolutely swore that Triple T was Shia LaBeouf and claimed that she'd seen him when he moved in. And when we showed her a photo of Shia LaBeouf, though, she said it was the other Shia LaBeouf, and we could never quite work out what she actually meant by that. One of the writers decided that Triple T was a ghost, like in the movie Ghost, and that his sculptures were all clay pots, and he was waiting for his Demi Moore to sit at the pottery wheel so he could finally create again. The singer claimed that Triple T was a beautiful woman whose face had been disfigured in a terrible car accident, which explained why some of her sculptures displayed in local galleries showed various figures in states of damage. Me, I just thought that Triple T was a reclusive sculptor who valued their privacy. and whenever TTT had a new sculpture to display, it would be found standing outside their apartment, and men in some suits from a certain gallery would come to collect it. Triple T always displayed at the same gallery, which I can't name for the same reason as not wanting to reveal myself. I did try knocking on Triple T's door a few times. Once or twice, I heard signs of life, and one time I was absolutely certain that I was being watched through a peephole. And just a gut feeling, but it did make me shiver. But if Triple T wasn't answering, I wasn't going to keep prying in there. And that's why it shocked me when, one Friday evening, I stepped out of my apartment ready to attend one of our weekly brainstorming sessions, only to see T's apartment door open a crack. Only darkness spilled from within, and I didn't want to enter without permission, so I just said, "Hello?" through the gap. No answer, although I was sure that I heard movement inside. The door was open. Someone could be in trouble, I thought. That was just sort of a justification enough to take a peek inside, right? And I turned on the flashlight app on my phone, but covered it with my palm just in case. And when I stepped inside, it was completely pitch black in there. I raised my phone, warning whoever was in there that I was about to light up the room, and then I slowly moved my hand away from the lens. I was not prepared for what I saw. The room was entirely bare. The walls and floor were sealed in plastic wrap. You know, the kind that they use in Dexter or some serial killer movies when they're about to kill someone in a room and don't want to leave blood splatter. And that wasn't the creepy part, though. The real creepy part was the statue that stood in the center of the room. It wasn't some kind of horror mannequin. It wasn't some horrific effigy of myself or anything else in the building. It was a classic-looking statue of the Holy Mother Mary, the kind that you find in a Catholic church. The only strange thing about her was that instead of a normal face, she'd been painted up to look like, of all things, a mime. I can't explain it, but I was absolutely certain that the statue was watching me. I was certain somehow that Triple T was the statue. The statue was Triple T. I took a tentative step forward and tapped the Mary statue. It was porcelain, and against my better judgment, I started to reach up and touch the face. It looked like flesh, and it looked so much like human flesh. My fingertips were less than an inch away, and I was about to touch it. I was about to touch TTT. And then I heard a noise in the room behind me. It was sort of like a muffled cry, like the word help. And I snatched my hand back from that statue and hurried to the door directly behind the statue. It was the only door in the room. And before trying to open it, I called out hello again. No response. I grabbed the door handle and twisted it. The door was locked, but the moment I twisted the door open, I heard a loud, shattering crash behind me. Quickly whipping around, I saw the Mother Mary statue shattering and collapsing to the floor. I had no idea what to do. Had I just destroyed some priceless artifact? I walked up to that debris as carefully as I could, and the face was just laying there, and I'd been right. It was skin, sort of. It was a latex ball with Mary's face painted on it, and then a voice spoke from an unseen speaker somewhere in the room. "I am TTT. This is art. You are the art. Please leave." And so I left. I left and ran down the stairs and cursed myself a million times for not filming what I'd just seen. I told everyone what had happened, and we all rushed upstairs, but TTT's door was once again locked. And once again, I was certain that as we all stood there, someone was watching us through that peephole. And 2 days later, there was a small portable safe left outside of TTT's apartment, and the same guys in suits came to collect it. 2 days later after that, I received a gilded invitation in the mail to attend a private showing at Gallery Redacted before it opened to the public, and the invite was from Triple T themselves. Of course, I went, hoping to meet the reclusive sculptor. No such luck. Triple T's agent was there and informed me that Triple T's final piece was being unveiled that night. Unlike all their other pieces, it was a video. It was a video showing me entering the apartment, a black bar across my face to protect my identity. It showed me from various camera angles, cameras that must have been hidden in the walls, in the ceiling, and then it showed me from the perspective of Mother Mary's eyes. And for a second, just a few frames, the censor bar disappeared and my face was replaced by that of a skull. And then it showed me rushing for the door, and here The camera split into two joint shots, one showing me turning the doorknob, the other showed the statue trembling and collapsing, clearly triggered by some kind of mechanism in the door. Then the rest mostly played out how I described it. Except as I picked up Mother Mary's head, again the sensor bar disappeared from my face and this time briefly showed an angel, like a Greek sculpture. And the final shot of the video was simply text saying, "Life is clay, and you are all my sculpture. Goodbye, TTT." That was the only time the video was shown. I've tried to track down a copy for this last year. If anyone out there has any leads at all, please let me know in the comments. But holy crap, this was the creepiest and most bizarre thing to happen to me, and I am obsessed with getting a copy of this video. If anyone has any leads, anyone at all, please comment. I need to see it again. I need to understand why Triple T was trying to say this and what it says about me. All the other artists in the boarding houses have theories, and I'll leave you to make up your own. But there's one thing I've learned from all of this, one universal truth that speaks to us all in our very soul. Artists are freaking weird, man. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations. Located anywhere you listen to podcasts. And I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All links in the description below. So, thanks so much, friends. And remember to ride your mountain bike with the seat off. My name's John, and I'm recently retired from the Washington State Patrol. I did the full 25, made it to lieutenant, and got my pension, and all in all, I'd say that I have very few regrets. But just like every other former cop out there, I got one or two cases that have followed me into retirement, some for the better and some for worse. Now, in early 2019, the State Patrol's Missing and Unidentified Persons Unit commenced a cold case initiative. Now, the goal was to assign a small group of experienced detectives to the piles of unsolved missing person cases sitting in the unit's archives. And since by then I had 12 years under my belt, it didn't surprise me when I got the call. We met one Monday morning when one of the MUPU guys showed us to the filing cabinet containing their cold cases. Looking inside felt like playing Russian roulette with all 6 chambers full, because no matter which one we picked, it was going to be a mess. And that's why we were the chosen ones, I guess, because we could handle messy and not burn out and end up chasing wild geese. But the very first one I picked ended up being one of the dirtiest and downright darkest cases I'd ever worked. And to protect those involved, I've omitted the names of all those involved, so my apologies if my prose is clunky in certain parts. But back in 2014, a retired oil rig supervisor and former Army engineer went missing from his home in Pullman. Now, his car was found a few weeks later over the state line in Idaho at a motel near McCroskey State Park. There were no signs of struggle near his car or in his hotel room, and the motel's security cameras showed him leaving the site on foot, looking calm and collected. The investigating detective noted that voluntary disappearance was a distinct possibility, since during the months prior to his disappearance, the missing man's marriage had deteriorated drastically. Yet there was no activity on any of his bank accounts, so if he had disappeared someplace, it was on somebody else's dime. Now, the first thing on my agenda was to go talk to the missing man's wife. She was a warm and friendly woman, but carrying the pain of her husband's disappearance for 5 long years had clearly taken its toll on her. She was living with a friend, a man who was evidently playing the role of a surrogate husband. But since both believed her husband was still alive, neither seemed prepared to make their affair public. If in fact there was an affair, and what they shared wasn't a platonic companionship. The missing man's wife confirmed that for around 6 months prior to his disappearance, their relationship had been strained. He'd been distant, preoccupied, and perpetually irritable, but for the life of her, she couldn't get him to tell her why. He'd been retired from the oil industry for a couple of years by that point, so it couldn't have been work getting to him. The only clue to his poor mental state was the fact that he spent long hours in the evening talking to an old army friend of his. Those nightly conversations continued right up until the day before he disappeared, and then when his wife woke up alone that morning, she found nothing but a note on the table which said, "I'm sorry, there's something I need to do." It was believed that McCroskey Motel, the one that his car was found at, had served as the meeting place between him and this old army friend he spent so much time talking to. And so, according to the wife, if anyone knew where he'd be, it'd be him. The only trouble was he'd refused to talk to anyone about his dealings with her husband, not even the local sheriff's department. She gave me the army buddy's contact details and advised me to reach out to him, albeit very gently and very politely. But then on the walk back to my car, the lady's friend caught up with me and had a thing or two of his own to share with me. Namely, his belief that the lady's missing husband was off working for the CIA. This friend seemed absolutely convinced that both our missing person and his old army buddy had both been working for the CIA on and off since they left the army. He said that he wasn't heading off around the country supervising oil rigs. He was going to CIA black sites to study extraterrestrial materials and technology. And when I asked what proof he had, the friend admitted that he didn't have much. But then again, he was right in that you can't just go calling the CIA and asking if such and such a person is an agent, because all you get in return is that movie cliche of, we can neither confirm nor deny. He was basing his theory around his suspicion that the old army friend lived the life of a CIA agent and that he traveled overseas a lot, had no obvious source of income, and spent a lot of time flying down to Reagan Airport, which services the CIA headquarters at Langley. I asked him how he knew all of this and was told that he'd done all of his own research. He was also quick to add that it was research the old army buddy hadn't taken kindly to. But in the friend's mind, that only confirmed the man's guilt. He then shared his belief that our missing person's final meeting with his old army buddy had actually been a kind of recruitment session, and that after swearing himself to secrecy, our missing person was off working on some secret project at some secret base somewhere. The wife's friend told me a bunch of other stuff about UAPs and Tic Tacs, as he called them, and both of which I found out were these new wave jargon meaning UFO. And as you can imagine, I didn't find myself taking many notes by the time he got around to all that stuff, but he was right about my next port of call being this old army buddy. He was also right when he told me that finding our missing person would involve wading into some very murky and very dangerous waters, just not in the ways he might have believed. Now, having received the old army buddy's contact details, I gave him a call as soon as I was able. But the UFO guy was right about how blunt he could be, and that's putting it kindly, because no sooner had I explained that I was calling about his missing friend, he made his feelings abundantly clear. He told me to never, ever call me again, and if he saw me sneaking around his property like that damn tinfoil hat son of a bitch, those are his words, by the way, he'd have me thrown in jail, just like he did with that goddamn ET-obsessed a-hole. His words again. And it was only then that I discovered that the UFO guy hadn't just conducted his own investigation as such, but had rather directed a prolonged campaign of harassment toward the old army buddy, one that had resulted in an arrest being made. Now, the old army buddy might have told me to get lost, but I didn't make detective by giving up that easy. I knew a former military man like him would respond much better to seeing a badge in person rather than hearing just a name over the phone. But before then, I knew he'd need some time to cool off, because approach too quick and that angry old bastard might have done more than just file a complaint. Instead, I decided to look into the missing man's background a little more to see if that'd provide any clues. And boy, did it ever. Like I said, you can't just go asking the CIA who's an agent and who's not. But the Army, on the other hand, they'll tell you just about anything you damn well ask, so long as the person's been discharged. His wife had told me our missing person had been a radio technician, and for a time, that was certainly true. But by the date of his discharge, he was serving in a very different role. Without getting too technical with the military speak, our missing person was part of an engineer battalion, but for some reason, served in an intelligence capacity following a period of specialized training. This is what's called an out-of-branch role, and while they're not unheard of, they're usually temporary positions that fill gaps in the organization. But our missing person spent 3 years in that intelligence role, while taking at least a few months out of each year to be trained by intelligence guys. Now, this was all interesting enough, but what really got my attention was how the Army couldn't seem to tell me why our missing person was discharged. All they provided me with was the date of it, October 5th of 2001. Now, to me, out of all the strange things I'd uncovered regarding our missing person, this was the strangest. And for the benefit of any young whippersnappers listening to this in the years to come, here's why it was so strange. So, less than a month before that discharge date, America experienced some attacks that happened in September of that year, the largest single loss of life on American soil committed by a foreign actor. Almost 3,000 people lost their lives, the New York skyline was irreparably altered, and folks from sea to shining sea wanted to get themselves some goddamn payback. Over 30,000 extra troops signed up over the next 6 months alone, and retention rates shot way up too, with more than ever choosing to re-enlist rather than miss out on going after Bin Laden and his boys. But then, if that was the case, how come our missing person not only turned down some pretty lucrative signing bonuses, but had his discharge fast-tracked? If he'd stayed enlisted for just 18 more months, he'd be entitled to his Army pension, and if I didn't know any better, I'd say it constituted a pretty shocking display of cowardice. But our missing person was certainly no coward. He'd served honorably in several war zones prior to the sudden discharge, and had even earned himself a Bronze Star for what he and his men did in Panama. Which had me wondering, did he really leave the engineers right after September of 2001 and opt to give up all that pension money? Or, much like undercover cops do, was he transferred someplace secret to be what you might call a deniable asset? The way to safely rule that out was to draw up a list of likely employers in the oil industry and then tick them off one by one until I found the one our missing person worked for. But when this went on for 3 whole days without result, I must have tried at least 100. And then, things finally made sense. Our missing person hadn't been working at an oil firm at all, and he'd lied to his wife and friends about where he was going. So what in the hell was he doing instead? I placed a few calls to his wife to arrange another talk. When she didn't answer any of them, I figured that she was just busy and told myself to be patient. But then the very next day, I got a call from an unknown cell phone number. Now, I figured she'd switched numbers and I'd been calling the old one, so I picked up and said something like, "Hi there, thanks for calling me back." But it wasn't our missing person's wife. It was his old Army buddy, the one who told me never to call him again. And as it turned out, there had been a major miscommunication that had resulted in years of misunderstanding. You see, the old Army friend didn't understand the severity of the situation. He figured there had been a divorce, maybe some infidelity, and then after running off someplace, his old friend just didn't want to talk anymore. Now, he didn't know his safety was in question, and if he had, he wouldn't have brushed off the first cop he spoke to 5 years previous. He knew his friend was troubled, he just didn't know how troubled. And then when he finally found out his old friend was actually missing, the first thing he did was give me a call. Now, I can't say too much about this old army buddy because he ended up telling me things that'd get him in a whole heap of trouble if his old bosses found out. But in the interests of uncovering the truth, he was more than willing to speak freely, just not over the phone. We met in person, somewhere private, and he told me that while the UFO guy had been crazier than a bag of hammers, he was right about one thing, and one thing alone. And that's how the old army buddy and our missing person had actually once served in the Central Intelligence Agency. I'd already established that our missing person had served in an intelligence capacity during his final few years in the Army, albeit in a very unusual one, and according to his buddy, this made him a prime candidate for an agency recruitment in the aftermath of September 2001. Just like I'd suspected, our missing person hadn't quit the Army at a time it needed him most. He just moved to a place where records aren't made public. And while I assumed he was given a job similar to the one he'd been doing in the engineers, I was very wrong. He hadn't been some kind of intelligence analyst. His job was very euphemistically titled interrogator. Unfortunately for the whippersnappers, it's time for another quick history lesson. Now, that time in September 2001 was a very dark time for America, obviously. Not just because of all the lives lost or how we realized our enemies could use our own liberties and successes against us, but also because of what we resorted to. Folks were so dead set on revenge and so scared that our enemies had something else up their sleeves that we ripped up the rule book in a way that had the founding fathers rolling in their graves. The Patriot Act was passed, meaning the government had the right to spy on its own citizens in a way that it never, ever had before. But that's not what our missing person was involved with. He was involved in developing and executing so-called advanced interrogation techniques, a very fancy newfangled term that conveniently replaced a very old one: torture. Our missing person, along with his old buddy, was inducted into a large team of CIA interrogators whose job was to fly over to Afghanistan and later to Iraq to extract information from people. Afghanistan had been slim pickings, and most of al-Qaeda guys either escaped into Pakistan or were picked up by U.S. Special Forces and flown to Guantanamo Bay to be interrogated there. But Iraq, and in particular this one city called Fallujah, it was a whole other story. After the invasion, coalition forces were busy dealing with the situation in Baghdad, and for good reason, with it being the center of power. But just 30 miles away, there's this city called Fallujah, and since the coalition was stretched so thin, they had to hire civilian contractors to police the place. International insurgents began using the city as a staging ground. Fallujah was flooded with weapons and equipment, and then in March 2004, 4 of those civilian contractors were ambushed, mutilated, and then hung from a bridge by insurgents as a way of saying, "Come get us." The solution was obvious: send in the Marines. But when they got there, they didn't find a handful of insurgents taking advantage of a city in chaos. They found a fortress. The insurgents fought hard, they fought smart, and they were dug in deep. And this wasn't some grassroots, fist-in-the-air resistance movement either, because while former Iraqi army officers were most definitely running the show, the rank and file consisted of terrorists from all over the world. There were guys from Egypt, Syria, Chechnya, even European countries like France and Germany, and the Marines knew that because they pulled their passports off their bodies after the fighting was done. These guys had to land in Syria and go through passport control just like everyone else, and only some of them had straight up written "Jihad in Iraq" as their reason for entering Syria. Once these guys realized the Marines were going to take the city, a lot of them simply dropped their weapons and tried to blend in with the civilians, rather than go all out in a blaze of glory. And then with the Marines surrounding the place to make sure they couldn't escape, military intelligence went snatching people up left and right before carting them off to the interrogators to see what they knew. And that's where our missing person enters the picture. He and his old buddy were with the Fallujah interrogation unit all throughout 2005, and according to the buddy, it was the single biggest regret of both of their careers. Since all the attention was on Baghdad, the Fallujah unit ran almost completely unsupervised, and things turned real messy real fast. Now, firstly, everyone was still very much in payback mode, so knowing that there were so many bad guys in town made them nothing short of bloodthirsty. I was told interrogations are supposed to be cold, withdrawn affairs, where an almost scientific approach is taken to physical and mental suffering. But the old buddies said the Fallujah team were openly talking about how good it felt to be dishing out some punishment. It wasn't even about getting answers anymore. Everyone knew some dumbass Libyan jihadist didn't know jack about September. He was just there because he heard he could shoot at Americans and maybe even secure his spot in paradise in the process. But the team didn't give a good goddamn. If he was there to kill Americans, then he was going to suffer. It got to the point where anyone who wasn't Iraqi-born was getting dragged off the street and interrogated, and not all of them made it through. The team had all kinds of people dragged in there, and some of them were tortured to death. The old army buddies said walking through their headquarters, which was heavily guarded and set up a few miles away in the desert, was like a living nightmare. All you could hear day and night were the screams. The place had to be constantly cleaned too because the smell of all that blood attracted flies, so it either smelled so heavily of bleach and other crap that it'd make your head ache, or it reeked of blood and you were constantly swatting flies away from your face. Anyone who died during interrogation ended up getting buried outside in the desert, and in the rare case the person was truly innocent, they were dumped by the side of the road for the rats and stray dogs to find. Everyone knew how terrible it was too. They hated the screams, they hated the stink of blood, they hated the flies. But I was told there was also this sense of, we all got a job to do, and it ain't a nice one, but it's an important one, so suck it up, Buttercup, because we could be the Marines getting our nuts blown off on the front lines. It was the perfect storm of evil, I guess, and I was told that it wasn't until a long time after that that they had this shared, what the hell did we do back there kind of moment. And then over time, as all the WMD stuff turned out to be all bullcrap and everyone found out how rich certain folks got on the back of all that death, they realized that all that pain and suffering they'd inflicted had been for nothing. The old buddies said that this went on for years, with our missing man going from true believer to openly questioning what the hell the US military was even doing in Iraq. Being on the CIA payroll kept him quiet, I guess, but after he retired, I was told our missing person got way, way worse. He took to drinking, and according to his friend, he drank a lot too. He said he needed to be able to sleep, and it went way beyond that as well. He realized just how many innocent people they'd hurt and killed, and how that was becoming harder and harder to live with. What's worse, he didn't have anyone but some agency shrink to talk about it to. His old buddy couldn't be there, not all the time, as he hadn't retired yet, and our missing person couldn't exactly go talking about classified stuff to a civilian doctor either. He was already teetering on the edge, and then something terrible happened. The buddies said that just before New Year's Eve of 2013, our missing person called him in the middle of the night and asked him to go to the website of some Arabic language news channel. There, he found a live video feed coming from a very familiar-looking Iraqi city, and as he watched in horror, our missing person talked him through what he was seeing. Fallujah, the city they'd inflicted 1,000 horrors upon in some sick, misguided attempt to save it, was under siege from a group of militants, one that appeared to be very well armed and very well trained. They were in the process of surrounding the place, just like the Marines had done 9 years before, and then about a week later, they drove out the Iraqi army and declared their first major victory. Neither man knew who the group were at the time, but cut to about 7 to 8 months later, and the whole entire world would know their name. And while that name sounded different depending on what language you spoke, in America, we called them ISIS. The old army buddy didn't know exactly when his friend had disappeared. He just got a call from him in February, not long before his car was found at the motel. But it wasn't hard to figure out the exact date our missing person had gone missing. I called his wife to ask if she could remember the exact date. Without skipping a beat, she said January 4th. It was a Saturday. The exact same day the news broke that Fallujah had fallen to ISIS terrorists. We think that was the straw which broke the proverbial camel's back, because after that, our missing person ended up drinking himself right down into a hole. His old buddy said that when he showed up to the bar that they met at, he looked like he had one foot in the grave already. And then all they spoke about were regrets and the lies and how it was all for nothing, absolutely nothing. The meeting didn't end well either. The old buddy suggested that he get help, but his missing friend said nothing could help him anymore, not booze, not even the church. He said he knew he was going to hell, that he'd inflicted so much pain that he could never even the scales. Now, our missing person also mentioned how they might be the last time that they'd see each other, but I guess the older army buddy didn't see that for what it was, and he left thinking that his old friend couldn't stand to see him anymore. Not when he was that much of a reminder of something he'd do anything to forget. Everything made a little more sense after the call with the old army buddy, and although it stayed off the record, I had a conversation with the missing man's wife confirming his former position at the CIA. And after that, it was a case of figuring out which direction he might have gone on foot following his departure from the motel. And while that proved a difficult process, I hoped that it'd at least give me something to work with. Well, it did, and when I found out what it was nothing short of devastating. It was in a bar that I ended up talking to a man who knew the area well. He'd grown up around McCroskey State Park and spent a lot of time there as a kid, so it was him who told me that the motel our missing person stayed at right before he disappeared was just a half-hour's walk away from a place they called Dead Man's Bridge. He told me the section of river it ran over were rapids, and that if a person fell in, they'd be bashed against the rocks before they hit a section of what's called an undertow. Now, this is when submerged obstacles like large rocks cause fast-moving water to go over the top, which creates a strong downward current that can drag swimmers beneath the surface. So basically, fall in the river near Dead Man's Bridge, and it will knock you out and drown you. He said it had become popular with a certain kind of person, people who were just too tired to go on and who saw something almost dignified in letting the river take them. Instead of being washed up downstream, all lifeless and looking like a drowned rat, the river fed into the Columbia, which spits anything that falls into it right out into the Pacific Ocean. And then once you're out there, you're good and gone, and no one's ever going to find you without a submarine and a whole lot of luck. It all suddenly made sense to me, and when it did, it hit me like a ton of bricks. Not just because I felt for our missing person, having been driven so crazy with guilt that he'd most likely opted to check out early, but because it was me who was going to have to tell his wife, a woman who'd been so utterly convinced by her friend that her missing husband was still alive, and that was one of the hardest things I'd ever have to do. Now, without a body, we couldn't officially declare the missing person's case closed, not without a warm or cold body as concrete proof. But after a while, I guess as she slowly came to accept it, the missing man's wife filed a petition to have him declared dead in absentia, which, for those who don't know, is when someone's been missing for so long that the only reasonable explanation is that they're deceased, or in the case of our now grieving wife, when you're 99% sure someone's deceased, you just can't 100% prove it. And only then, once it's been made official, could we take the file out of the cold case cabinet and put it where it belongs. Back in March of 1998, I was a 32-year-old prosecutor here in my native Belgium. I've been in the job for 3 years, so I was still relatively new, and after spending years focused on less significant crimes like financial fraud, I was finally handed my first murder trial. I relished it, knowing that first impressions mattered, and if I may say so myself, I think I did myself proud. My stubbornness, along with a certain refusal to look away from unpleasant facts, impressed my superiors immensely, so much so that a few weeks later, on a drizzly Tuesday morning, I received what I can only describe as a life-changing telephone call. A colleague from the International Criminal Tribunal had seen my file and was particularly impressed by a conviction I'd achieved a few years prior, pertaining to a case involving systematic abuse in Belgian prisons. I'd also written a piece on command responsibility during the Yugoslav wars, with a particular focus on the failure to prevent the genocide of Croats and Bosniaks, and this too had gotten the attention of the ICT. I was offered a job, one that was very well paid and came with a generous expense account, but there was also a catch. I was told they needed someone who understood bureaucracy and blood, the name of my written piece, as well as someone who wouldn't flinch when confronted with evidence of extreme violence. And if I accepted, I'd end up living and working in a place whose name had been synonymous with some of the worst crimes in human history: Rwanda. Now, my first instinct was to say no. I was dealing with a heavy caseload at the time, one of which involved bringing charges against a prolific distributor of CSEM, and I didn't want to walk away from the case, and I didn't want to walk away from my colleagues either. But after giving my hastily conceived answer to the ICT's recruitment officer, I was told that I had a few weeks to think about it. And then over time, my refusal started to feel less and less like a polite decline and more like cowardice. You see, many years before, my own country of Belgium had colonized Rwanda and rolled through a system of ethnic identity which divided people into one of two categories: Hutu or Tutsi. The colonial government vastly favored the Tutsi minority, who were much more keen to cooperate than the Hutu majority. But this only created a huge amount of resentment between the two groups of people, and when the Belgians granted Rwanda its independence, this system of governance didn't change. The Tutsis clung to power, and then by the early 90s, Rwanda wasn't so much a functional state as it was a powder keg just waiting to explode. There was already a civil war brewing by the time the country's Hutu president was assassinated by its own presidential guard, who were also Hutu. Then the extremists behind the plot used his death as a casus belli to begin a slaughter of biblical proportions. Militias known as Interahamwe set up roadblocks, having already drawn up lists of Tutsi officials and other community figures they wished to round up and kill. Radio stations then broadcast names and addresses, calling them cockroaches and urging their extermination. Rwanda wasn't a particularly segregated place either, particularly the larger cities like its capital, Kigali. So while out in the countryside, bands of armed soldiers engaged rebel fighters en masse in the cities, neighbors slaughtered neighbors in the streets outside their homes. In one of the more horrifying accounts of genocide, a Hutu parish priest murdered his own Tutsi parishioners by bayoneting them to death. Others were killed with everyday items such as gardening tools like hoes or shovels. Carnal violation was used as a weapon of war, and any moderate Hutus who tried to give shelter to Tutsi friends received the same treatment as those they tried to protect. In just over 3 months of violence, anywhere between 800,000 to 1 million people were killed. Bodies clogged rivers, while mass graves were dug in schoolyards and football fields, and all the while, the international community did next to nothing. The violence only stopped after a militant group named Rwandan Popular Front arrived from the north, stormed the capital city, and restored order. But what remained was truly terrible. What was once a fractured nation had become like a charnel house, and I was all too aware of the violence and the suffering there. And then, since Western governments had done nothing for the people and still hadn't after 4 long years, I thought the least that I could do was help count the dead. I flew into Kigali during the wet season of 1999 and found myself part of a small team including a forensic anthropologist from the United States, a Dutch investigator, a Canadian Special Forces officer acting as security, and 2 Rwandan translators. We were briefed by a senior member of the ICT at a UN encampment. Intelligence reports suggested that there was a rural property in a region south of the capital named Bugesera, in which a Tutsi family had been murdered by a Hutu mob. The files spoke of a series of murders, and I expected perhaps 7 or 8 bodies, but nothing could have prepared me for what we found. Absolutely nothing. It rained so much that by the time we arrived at the property, the road had turned into a red paste that clung to the wheels and to our boots. It looked like many of the other homesteads we passed on the way: mud brick walls, a tin roof with banana groves sloping down to a small stream below. It was very pretty in its own way, but as soon as we got within about 30 to 40 meters, we started to smell the decay of death inside. Inside the main house, the floors were gray concrete, and it had been stained black in many places where blood had pooled and dried over time. The largest room on the ground floor, the kitchen and dining space, had been converted into a slaughter chamber. Hooks still hung from the ceiling beams, their sharp points still displaying flecks of gore, and a long table had been placed against one of the walls in which deep channels had been carved into the wood to drain fluids. Empty shell casings littered the room, with our security detail pointing out that while most of them were from Russian AKs, a few were from Belgian FALs. Weapons made by my country, weapons that we'd left there which were now being used to commit the most horrendous acts of pointless violence, and it made me sick to my stomach. Outside, we found a makeshift crematorium consisting of an oil drum furnace rigged with iron grates. And when I looked inside, I noticed how its interior crusted with charred bone fragments and teeth, and while nearby, a shallow pit had been dug and filled in. We didn't have to scrape away much of the dirt to start finding remains either, and some were small enough to belong to children no older than 8 or 9. And to find such a sizable amount of human remains was one thing, and to know some were children was a horror I can barely describe. But it was the personal effects that broke something in me. In one of the home's back rooms, stacked in a haphazard piles all over the floor, were the clothes of those who had been murdered. There must have been thousands of clothes piled on top of each other, men's shirts, women's shawls, and hundreds of shoes all missing their pairs. I remember seeing a single red high heel that must have belonged to someone who dressed well for what she thought was a meeting or an arrest. I also remember seeing what I'm quite certain was a part of a school uniform, along with a tiny pair of plastic sandals depicting cartoon characters. What pushed me over the edge was picking up a child's sweater, a pale blue one with a knitted duck on the front. It was stiff with dry blood. I kneeled and set it down carefully, as though disturbing it would wake the dead, and then by the time that I was at my full height again, I was crying. By the end of that day, I wanted to leave that place, leave Rwanda, and never return. But we ended up going to and from that house for 3 whole weeks before I was able to fly home again. Our forensic anthropologist cataloged bones under a tarp in the courtyard, and by the end of those 3 weeks, she estimated that at least 280 individuals had been murdered there, and that's not including those whose remains may have already been incinerated. Our Dutch investigator, a nice man named Peter, interviewed survivors from nearby villages. They said the trucks came at night and how they couldn't sleep because of the screams. One old woman described seeing a Hutu community leader directing operations. Another mentioned soldiers from the former Rwandan armed forces. Peter wrote down many names, but there were no documents, no paper trail, and since the killer had been careful to ensure no cameras were around, so while there were plenty of pictures of the bodies, we couldn't find a single piece of footage depicting killings of any kind. And we seized what little we could. Things like a handful of identity cards were pulled from the pockets of that discarded clothing, or a rusted pistol registered to a man still living openly in Kigali. Now, that was the only significant piece of evidence we found in terms of connecting a murderer to their victims, and only then, it may have accounted for only a handful of deaths in a genocide committed mostly by everyday household items. I remember spending long evenings writing reports by lamplight, drinking warm beer by the dozen to keep the rage from clouding my judgment. And not just rage at the killers either, but rage at my own country of Belgium. It was Belgium who issued the ethnic identity cards in the first place, cards which might as well have been death warrants if they had Tutsi written on them. And just like when we found those bullets, I've never been more ashamed of my country. On the whole, the investigation was an uphill struggle for the first week, and it didn't get any easier as the weeks went by. You might have had an expense account, but there was a strict limit on what we could spend on any given day. Then, because ours was only a small part of a much wider investigation, we received only minimal support for the tribunal's HQ in neighboring Tanzania. Now, what's worse, we put people's lives at risk. Now, in many cases, the witnesses we convinced to testify received visits from men on motorcycles after dark. And then the next time we visited them, they changed their stories and either couldn't remember or didn't see. We had a lot of anecdotal evidence, but barely anything tangible, so it soon became a case of knowing who had been part of that bloodthirsty mob, but not being able to pin anything on them. For example, one afternoon, our van drove past a man repairing a fence at a homestead only 3 or 4 kilometers away from the kill house. One of the translators saw him as he drove past and started pointing and talking to the other in a way that we couldn't understand. We quickly switched to English and explained how the man we'd passed had been spotted unloading bodies from a truck back during the genocide. But what disturbed me the most was how the man politely waved as we passed. It was like he didn't have a care in the world. Like all the violence had been swept under the carpet by people who could just switch off that part of themselves and go back to normal. We exhumed what we could from the pit in the backyard, then photographed, measured, and sealed everything away in evidence bags. We spent one last day in Kigali debriefing with members of the tribunal and the UN, but the conclusions were stark. We had boxes of bones and clothing samples, and my report was thick with notes. But when all was said and done, convicting just one of the homestead executioners would mark the achievement of a lifetime, but all of them, that was as close to impossible as it was possible to be. The case was provisionally docketed but never brought to trial. The landscape of the investigation was an ever-shifting one which constantly had new priorities, new mass graves, and new political realities to deal with. We later heard that the only identifiable subject had died of malaria in a refugee camp, disguised as a victim of the genocide and not a perpetrator. But the others are still free to walk among the same communities they once terrorized. They are businessmen, minor officials, and respected elders. They attend church on Sundays with people they'd shed blood with. Their children go to school with the children of some of their victims. Sometimes, late at night in my apartment in Brussels, I open the sealed plastic container I kept against all protocol. Inside is one small red sandal, sized for a child of perhaps 6 years old. I don't know why I kept it. Evidence of failure, maybe, or perhaps a reminder that justice is not a natural force, but a fragile human invention that is easily starved of resources and will. And that's why all those shoes we found will stay empty and those of the killers wander far and free. The world, as I've found, moves on far, far too easily. I don't work for the UN anymore, but it sometimes comes up in conversation with the youngest lawyers I work with. They sometimes ask how I coped, and I tell them the truth. I didn't cope with anything. Everything I saw, everything I heard, I still carry it with me. I remember the smell of that house and the small blue sweater with the knitted duck and the rows of silent shoes. I'm told the compound near Nyamata still stands, but locals avoid it after dark. The country itself has forgotten, but the people still remember. And so do I. Back in the 70s, my old man used to be a homicide detective here in Houston. He worked some brutal cases over the years, and he's told me many a story that's replayed in my head when the lights are off and I'm just curled in bed in silence. But out of all of them, this is the one that stayed with me for the longest, and it's all to do with what he always called the Orchard apartment murders. So back in the late 70s, Houston was booming with oil money, and all that oil money had people pouring into the city trying to get a piece of it. But whenever there's a big influx of people from elsewhere, some of which are going to be very down on their luck, you get yourself a little spike in crime to go along with it. Dad said the number of homicides spiked, not by much, but it was noticeable, and then one night, it started. I double-checked just to make sure, but the night on the first murder was July 27th of 1979, and no prizes for guessing this happened at the Orchard Apartments in southwest Houston. Most of the units are pretty small, so they tend to house a lot of single workaday folks, and the same was true even back then for a lady named Alice Rankin. Now, Google's telling me she was a 33-year-old secretary and single mom, and then one morning, since her car was in the shop, a coworker of hers stops by to give her a ride to the office. Now, he's buzzing her apartment, but she's not answering, right? So he gets inside somehow and then walks all the way up to her place, only to find the door slightly ajar. The guy then steps inside to take a look around and see if Alice is okay. And then when he walks into the bedroom, it must have been like walking onto the set of a horror movie. There's Alice, lying on her bed with no clothes on. Her feet are tied, and there's a pillow covering her from the neck up. But when the coworker pulls the pillow away, there's no Alice to check on at all. Just a stump where her head used to be. Someone had her killed, violated her, then took her head with them as a trophy. Now, my dad said that there was a blood trail that went all the way from Alice's apartment to the building's rear entrance, meaning whoever cut her head off just straight up walked out of the building with it, probably holding it by the hair. Alice's head was never found, and neither was her killer. But Dad said that right as they were still working out to figure out the first murder, the second hit less than 2 weeks later. Alice Rankin's apartment wasn't a crime scene anymore, and the cops had no reason to closely guard the building, because why would they? Dad said everyone figured that it was a crime of passion, maybe a former lover that had taken their breakup a little too hard and thought, if I can't have her, no one can. No one figured the killer would return to the exact same building to do the exact same thing. But that's exactly what they did. 2 weeks later, and 2 floors up, a lady named Mary Calcutta rented an apartment after moving here from Pittsburgh. Her friends back home had heard all about what had happened to Alice Rankin, so they'd been telling her to lock her doors, look over her shoulder, don't talk to strangers, all that kind of stuff. And she told them that she'd be extra careful, and I'm sure she was too, but sadly, that didn't save her. Much like Alice, she was found naked in her bedroom, but instead of being tied up and decapitated, Dad said it looked like Mary had put up one heck of a fight. It wasn't so much a case of looking for signs of a struggle as looking for a place there hadn't been one, and it was probably thanks to how hard she fought that her killer didn't have time to completely cut her head off. He slit her throat and stabbed her a bunch of times, but the fight was so loud that he was probably scared that someone had called the cops. So instead of calmly walking out with Mary's head swinging in his grip, this monster probably ran for his life. Now, my old man said he was convinced the same guy did Alice and Mary. It was the same apartment complex, 2 women living alone in the same brutal style of killing in each case. Every other woman at Orchard Apartments thought that they were next too, and Dad said that they were all buying guns, walking in groups at night, or straight up packing up and moving elsewhere. The panic was real, especially because the very same day Mary's body was found, another body showed up on the other side of town. Dad said it was an exterminator that walked into this lady's townhouse on Early Lane after he showed up for an appointment that she made with him. And that's when he found this girl, Doris Threadgill, with her neck cut most of the way through. This time there were no signs of any struggle, and I know it's only a small mercy, but Doris was thankfully found with her clothes on. Dad said the scene made it look like he'd gained entry to the house under false pretenses, almost like Doris thought her killer was the exterminator and didn't realize he wasn't until it was too late. It was just different enough for some to suggest it was the work of a different psycho altogether, but Dad was never convinced. He said the work on her neck was just too similar, that the MO matched in all the right places for him, and they got chills thinking Houston now had its very own spree killer, maybe even a serial killer, to use what, at the time, was a fancy new term. Dad said things seemed like they couldn't get any worse, and it wasn't just his own caseload, everyone else's was piling up too. And then suddenly, things did somehow manage to get worse when the dead bodies of a teenage couple showed up miles apart from each other. The girl's body was found in a park someplace. Now, Google is saying it was at Watonga, but I'd swear that my dad said it was Freed, But the boy's body was found in a used car lot, but only his body, not his head. That was missing. Dad said that there was nothing in the way of strong forensic evidence to link it to the apartment murders, so officially speaking, they were seen as unconnected. But again, my dad has no doubt. He thinks the same killer spotted the girl alone and maybe even attacked her out in the open that night. But when he was interrupted by her boyfriend, it was him who suddenly became the target for getting his head cut off. Dad and his squad ran down every lead, fingerprints, witnesses, knives, everything. But since there was no DNA technology back then, they had to do everything the hard way and without computers. Dad said that he heard they submitted evidence later for testing, but no hits came back. And since at the time not even a single likely suspect was named, there was no arrests either. No arrests, no trial, no justice, nothing. Dad retired without closing it, and whenever he used to tell me the story, he'd always end up shaking his head, grumbling about how the families never got any peace or justice. He said the way Orchard Apartments got hit twice in quick succession, and how the killer liked taking heads, it suggested a kind of evil that was almost like unholy, you know? Whoever killed those poor people, and either cut their damn heads off or tried to, they were crazy as an outhouse rat, no doubt about it. But at the time, they were smart enough to make sure that they never got caught, and even real smart people aren't smart enough to not get caught slipping. You also got to remember neither of the two missing heads were ever recovered, meaning that maybe somewhere, out there, there was an old man with two frozen heads in a unit, and he takes them out every so often, ageless and looking the same as they did almost half a century ago, which really is like something out of a horror movie. Dad always said that that was the one case he'd do anything to be able to go back and solve, and I can understand why. Being able to bring justice to those poor families would have been quite something, but I imagine putting that sick son of a bitch in cuffs after working so incredibly hard to track him down, that would have been a heck of a thing too. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday and Wednesday night. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All the links are down in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, life isn't free. The way one falls from such a high jump, flop, flop, floppy. My name's Drew, and back in the early 90s, I was a student up at Evergreen State College in Washington. It's a beautiful campus, but it was also kind of out of the way. So unless you had a car, you had to either attach yourself to someone who did, or you had to find something to do on campus in between cramming or part-time jobs or whatever you're up to. Now Josh, one of the guys I shared a class with, worked at the campus TV station. And then one day, since they were short a few people, he asked if I wanted to come over and help out for an afternoon. Now, I didn't have anything better to do, and it sounded more exciting than sitting around the quad all afternoon doing nothing, and so off we went. Now, it was hard to believe that they were making actual TV shows there, but that's exactly what I watched them do, and with an impressive level of professionalism, too. The week after, I asked my buddy if he needed any extra help again. And then before long, I was running the audio board for other people's shows or editing tape on those big linear editing decks that took forever for stuff to queue up. Now it was fun as hell, and I got to meet a ton of weird, cool people. Like this one guy doing a dorm room cooking show with nothing but a hot plate, Or this other guy who used to rant about the Seahawks until he was red in the face and the veins were bulging in his neck. We'd record the shows, transfer them to VHS, then after sending them off to the cable channel, we'd throw little watch parties whenever they aired. Now, it was an awesome feeling seeing it go out over the airwaves, and I immediately started thinking how cool it'd be to have something I'd made broadcast as far as Tacoma. Now, I had to wait until someone quit their slot, of course, as there weren't any free ones available. But when our Seahawks guy finally ran out of trash to talk about his team, I had an opportunity to take a slot for myself. The only question was, with what? Now, I brainstormed all kinds of ideas and briefly entertained the idea of doing comedy skits. But then, I had a brainwave. Everyone has at least some local pride, right? And the one thing everyone enjoys is a damn good mystery story. So if I planned out a show that involved investigating local mysteries and led with a story that everyone would identify with, I might actually get some eyeballs on my work. And the one local legend that got not just national, but international attention was good old Bigfoot. Now, Bigfoot was actually a personal interest of mine, just not in the way you think. I was a believer once, and after moving to the Pacific Northwest, I read On the Track of the Sasquatch and The Apes Among Us by John Green, as well as The Bigfoot Casebook by Janet and Colin Board. The Apes Among Us is a particularly fascinating read, and Green is very passionate about the subject. There's just one problem. I don't believe a word of it anymore. Logically speaking, we'd have probably found Bigfoot's skeleton by now, and I'm not just talking about Peter Kane dog trainer, as while there are a plethora of other reasons why the Bigfoot myth is just that, a myth, the biggest debunker is the issue of the remains. But what I'd never personally seen is anyone putting those reasons to a true believer, one who'd actually done the research on it themselves, and if done respectfully and amicably, I figured I might have cracked the formula to some pretty great television. Now, I managed to find a guy who ran a guided Bigfoot tour that included a night of camping in areas where there had been plenty of sightings, apparently. Now, I'm guessing the camping alone gave the guests a spooky enough atmosphere when all they were really doing was hanging out and having fun together with some like-minded people. Now, I get it, man, I do. It's fun to have friends and tell spooky stories, but I wanted to know if what the guide was saying stood up to any scrutiny. And not in a mean, you're a liar, mister kind of way, more like as a way of exploring the veracity of the subject in a way that didn't sensationalize it, and asking all the questions folks at home wanted to ask on their behalf. Now, I didn't think that'd be an attractive prospect, but luckily, Brandon, the tour guide, actually agreed to it. Now, Brandon was a real character. He was warm, friendly, and immediately saw my offer as an opportunity to promote his business. He said he didn't mind if I had questions because he'd been answering them for the better part of 20 years. And as long as I didn't try making him look stupid in front of the other folks on the tour, I was welcome to ask anything I wanted. Now, my buddy Josh and I went out to meet him one weekend to shoot some opening footage that had run before that of the actual tour. Brandon looked like I imagined him. Flannel shirt, jeans, big mustache, and beer gut. Now, he was also so excited to be on a TV show, even if it was just public access, that he made for a fantastic interviewee. By the time we were done with the segment, I was actually psyched to go on the tour with him, if only for the fact it'd be fun to hang out with him overnight in the woods. And even if I didn't get to debunk the whole Bigfoot thing, and in the space of a half-hour cable access show, it'd still make for great viewing. And when the Saturday of the tour rolled around, me and Josh drove out to where Brandon was based. We borrowed a car and one of the station's crappy camcorders, and then once all of Brandon's tourists were assembled, we hit the trails, and it wasn't long before my questions began. When Brandon talked about eyewitness sightings, I brought up how unreliable they were. Then when he brought up tracks and footprints, I brought up how the famous Patterson-Gimlin tracks were eventually proven to be a hoax. I kept it friendly. There was no gotcha moments, and the other guests actually enjoyed us talking about Native American references to megafauna. And we agreed. and quite excitedly too, that modern technology brought us all closer to a definitive truth, but at least one of the other guests did not appreciate our approach. There was this older guy who looked to be in his late 40s, jean shorts, hoodie, ball cap, shades. Now, he'd been quiet for almost all of the hike, but his facial expressions and body language were getting louder and louder. Then when me and Brandon started discussing Bigfoot population numbers, he boiled over completely. Brandon made the point that animals which adapt to colder climates generally exist in low numbers, like in the case of polar bears or certain kinds of whales. It was a pretty solid retort to my point that an ape the size of Bigfoot would need a large population to avoid inbreeding. But when I circled back around to the point about calorie consumption, as Bigfoots would have to eat crazy amounts of food and would therefore leave a crazy amount of poop, I imagine, the guy with the ball cap and shades turned around and got right up in my face. The man that I'll only refer to as Angry Dave was all red and puffed up, asking what my problem was, and saying that a Bigfoot tour wasn't some place for some close-minded college kid. I tried telling him I wasn't close-minded, that I'd read a bunch of literature on the topic and I wanted nothing but the truth. But Dave replied that I knew nothing about the woods or real life and accused me of trying to ruin the tour for everyone else just so I could feel like a smarty party. Now I get why he was mad, and Josh had already suggested how joining an actual tour might lead to something like that. Brandon had insisted that we do just that, probably because the presence of a TV camera made him look all newsworthy or whatever. And I guess he felt his share of the blame too, because he stepped in fast to say, "It's okay, I invited the guy," offering a more private tour at Angry Dave's convenience. But Dave didn't want to hear it. He stepped closer, got louder, and even looked like he was about to swing for me at one point. Between myself, Josh, and Brandon, we managed to calm him down enough to continue the tour, with Dave doing nothing but glaring at me every time I spoke. Now, I kept the questions to an absolute minimum following the confrontation, as in addition to the nighttime stuff we were about to shoot, Josh and I had more than enough footage to put together a 30-minute segment. Now, once we had all of our tents set up, Brandon had got a little campfire going and conversations moved away from Bigfoot and the tension started to lift. Even Angry Dave started to lighten up a little, even if he did roll his eyes or shake his head at pretty much anything me or Josh came on with. Now, after we all retired to our tents, Josh and I shot a little more footage, basically saying that we'd started shooting again if we heard any creepy noises. Now, we didn't expect to hear any. In fact, I was convinced that if we did hear any noises, it'd be Brandon out there faking them to play a friendly prank on the skeptics. But as it turned out, on that point, I was dead wrong. I was pretty tired from all the walking, and me and Josh had to get up super early that morning to check our gear. So once we shot our tent footage and lay down in our bedrolls, I don't think either of us lasted even a minute before we were dead to the world. I guess we were out around 3 hours or so, because the next thing I know, Josh is shaking me awake at like 1 in the morning while whispering, Dude, listen." We stayed quiet for a second, and then I suddenly heard this loud, sharp thwacking sound in the distance, like someone was hitting the trunk of a tree with a large branch. It might sound strange, but it was such a clearly identifiable sound, but it was also one with some very sinister connotations. Now, for those of you that don't know, Bigfoot is supposed to hit trees with sticks as a form of communication. Some say it's how Bigfoots talk to each other, and it is Bigfoots, not big feet, but others say that they're a warning to humans, and the people who've ignored these warnings have then mysteriously gone missing. Now, I didn't think it was Bigfoot at all. I thought it was Brandon. But when we got out of the tent with the camera, I saw Brandon and another tourist standing there all wide-eyed and looking spooked. I guess it was sort of a nervous reaction on my part, but I whispered a joke to Brandon about how I figured the noise would be him trying to play a prank on us. I thought he might see the funny side, but he didn't. He just shook his head like he well and truly believed it was Bigfoot out there, and then shushed us so we could keep on listening to those spaced out thwacking sounds. Now, Brandon had already explained what we were hearing during the tour, so as all the other tourists got out their tents to join us, each of them had that same look of fear and wonder on their faces. I started whispering to the camera to explain the sounds, and then out of nowhere, we all heard this blood-curdling scream from off in the distance, about the same distance the dull thwacks were coming from. Everyone's like, "Oh my God," and even Brandon looked terrified. And I won't lie, Josh and I got pretty spooked too, and I remember thinking it was some type of prank, and then it was a damn good one. But then, one of the other tourists realized that Angry Dave's tent was empty, and I watched Brandon's head just spin around, terrified. He asked if anyone had seen or heard him, and one of the others said that they'd woken up to hear him walking off somewhere like he went to pee, but evidently he hadn't returned. Someone else then asked if Dave might have gone looking for the source of the sound, and since that scream sounded like it came from a man of Dave's age and size, Brandon went into full-on crisis mode, thinking that this guy was hurt. Now he grabbed his flashlight and then went tearing off into the woods, yelling Dave's name. The rest of us followed like we were programmed to, with the tourists close behind, and Josh and I at the rear with the camera. We ran for about a minute or two, all yelling out Dave's name, and when Brandon stopped, we stopped too. He asked us to fan out and look around, as Dave might be so hurt that he actually couldn't respond. Now, one of the other tourists then asked if he thought that Bigfoot had outright killed Dave and might have dragged him off someplace after attacking him, but Brandon said he didn't know, and it was like that answer made things worse for everyone. They wanted him to have answers, so when he didn't, it frightened everyone all the more. Now, I didn't think we were about to encounter a Bigfoot. I thought Dave had walked off and taken some tumble in the dark, or worse, maybe gotten himself attacked by an animal or something. Now, just because he hadn't been attacked by some mythical creature didn't mean that he wasn't in danger, and the same applied to us, too. Walking through those dark woods was seriously scary, and it's crazy how much fear can make you doubt yourself. And by that, I mean I was scared that I actually started wondering if I was about to be proved wrong about Bigfoot, and in spectacularly horrifying fashion. I didn't fully start to believe or anything. I just struggled to compute how nightmarishly ironic it'd be if I was torn apart by something I didn't even believe existed. Brandon had his gun with him, but no one else was armed, so I had to go walking through the dark forest with nothing but a big stick in my hand and a camera in Josh's. The whole time I'm yelling Dave's name, asking him to call out to us to let us know where he is. But I'm also spinning on the spot to face every little noise, like I was expecting Bigfoot to come rushing out of the darkness into our flashlight beams before picking us up and bashing us against the trees. I had my head on a swivel, and Josh had to do everything in his power to keep a steady shot, and he still couldn't keep his hands from shaking. But when it came too quickly for either of us to do anything about it, and I barely even saw that giant stick before it smashed into my head. I went down like a ton of bricks, while Josh was so startled by the sudden presence that he fell back on his butt and dropped the camera. But even if he hadn't, and he kept on filming as that stick smashed into my ribs, and then hips, and then legs, he wouldn't have recorded me getting attacked by a Bigfoot, because the only person attacking me was Angry Dave. Mine and Josh's yelling attracted the attention of the others, and to his absolute credit, it was Brandon who showed up seconds later with his gun drawn, telling Dave to put the stick down or he'd shoot. Now, I guess there's no love lost between me and Dave at this point, but while I appreciate that some of you might think I'm exaggerating to make him look bad, I'm definitely not. And so when I say he looked so out of his mind with rage that it appeared that he might charge at Brandon at any second, I'm not just saying that. And for a moment or two, I was legitimately scared that I was about to watch him get his head blown off. He looked at Brandon, then down at me like he wanted to just keep on hitting me. But right as he raised the stick up again, Brandon yelled out that he'd shoot if he hit me again. And that sort of brought Dave back to reality, I guess. He stepped back, dropping the stick while still red as a beet. Then I guess when he realized what he'd done and how we might have had it all on camera, we didn't, Dave turned and went running back to the camp to grab his stuff. He left just as hastily as Brandon and the other tourists yelled at him, saying the cops would be informed. I remember feeling a little smug, knowing that he'd given me all the ammo I needed to get his ass thrown in jail. But he hit me so hard that I had blood running down from my hairline, and it hurt so bad that I knew I needed to get to a hospital right away. Dave had obviously faked all the stick sounds and the scream, and according to the cops, his original intention was only to scare me. But when he saw me and Josh with our camera, especially me being lit up like a freaking Christmas tree, the red mist descended, and he attacked me with the same stick that he'd been using to hit that tree. He ended up spending about 6 months inside, which was better than nothing, I guess, whereas I got myself a nice little hairline scar as a souvenir. It sucked having to get stitches and stuff, and for a while, the doctors were worried that I'd have a pretty bad concussion. But to me, the worst thing was that Brandon revoked his permission for us to air the footage. He'd already signed a waiver, but Josh and I didn't much feel like going to war with him over it, so to speak, and he'd been so nice and welcoming it wasn't his fault that he accidentally brought along some fanatical psycho. Airing the footage would have the opposite effect on his business, so when he coupled his revocation with a polite request, I couldn't find it in myself to just ignore it. I guess that's about the end of the story, though. But don't worry, I'm not going to try and end on some poignant line about lessons learned, because I think the lessons here are obvious to all who wish to learn them. So, my mom was originally from Russia, and she lived up there during the Soviet years, but she never really talked about it while I was growing up. I learned this was because you could divide Soviet immigrants into one of two categories: those who talked about their old lives back in the USSR, and those who didn't. And those who talked tended to complain about it, saying things like, "We had equality for all, equally empty shelves and equally long lines." Or my personal favorite, "The future was bright, the present was gray, and the past was whatever the party said it was." But those who didn't talk about it, you learn not to pry. Some people escaped communism with nothing but nightmares and the clothes on their back. And thankfully, while nothing too terrible ever happened to Mom, she had a few stories of her own. Now, back when she was still a student, Mom volunteered to work at a pioneer camp for the summer, which was exactly the same as an American summer camp in almost every way. She was a guardian there, which is basically what they called their counselors, and in addition to all the games, activities, and fresh air, guardians served up generous doses of Soviet propaganda. Mom said the camps were like paradise on the surface, but in this one place, beneath the smiles and the slogans, there was a kind of tension in the air. From what she could gather, the head guardian had been selected by this one committee. Almost everything in Russia at that time was run by committee, so the decision of the guardian appointing committee had to be ratified by this other committee. Now, once their approval had been secured, the head guardian was approved. But then the head of the other committee suddenly changed his mind because his spoiled, bratty-ass son wanted to be head guardian. Now, the guy goes about trying to reverse the decision, first by bureaucracy, but when that failed, he turned to threats. No one threatened the head guardian, not directly anyway, but there was talk of having him removed, even closing the camp down completely. Mom said this went on for like 2 weeks, getting a slow drip of information, partly fact and partly rumor. And then one day, the head guardian announced the whole thing was over. A decision had come down from on high, guaranteeing his place at the camp for the next couple of years, and since the guy was a pretty beloved figure, everyone was happy about it. Every person except one. Mom said a few nights later, after all the kids had been put to bed, she was doing her rounds on the second floor of a dorm. She remembered checking in on this one group when suddenly this deep feeling of unease came over her. Russia's a place of extremes, Super cold in the winter, but then depending where you're at, it can get super hot during the summer. Now that night was no different, so the air in all the dorms was very warm. But in that one, the air felt just like a little too warm in places. And then suddenly, she started to smell the smoke. She could tell right away it wasn't just campfire smoke. A smell she was very familiar with by then because the smoke that night had an artificial, chemical sort of scent to it. Then, when she ran to the window and saw flames licking up the walls from the ground floor, she realized fire was spreading fast. So Mom hit the dorm's alarm and in doing so, unleashed total chaos. The alarm scared the kids half to death, so they were almost blind with panic as they came tearing out of their rooms. Things would have been way worse if Mom and some other guardians weren't bunked in the same building and they were able to restore a little order once they came out of their rooms. But then when a guardian discovered the stairwells were full of smoke, they realized that to escape, they had no choice but to basically throw the kids from the second-floor windows, and they had to do it fast. Smoke was building up, people were coughing, and as the kids were starting to panic. Mom said that at first some of the older ones tried to help the little ones, but it wasn't long until panic took over and the guardians lost control. And then not only did she watch kids literally climbing over each other, but kids as young as 6 or 7 were pushing open the windows and then just leaping out into the dark before hitting the ground with these sickening thuds. Now, it was only the second floor, so the kids who jumped didn't get hurt too bad. But they were landing on concrete, so Mom said it was still pretty horrifying to hear their thuds as they landed awkwardly, followed by their screams of pain as they broke bones or sprained ankles. And outside on the ground, camp guardians were running around with buckets of water doing anything they could to at least slow the spread, but Mom said those buckets were all but useless against those flames. More adults poured out into the scene from the staff quarters while Mom kept on herding the kids towards the windows. One little disabled girl she was carrying went limp in her arms from the smoke, and Mom had to fight through the crowd to get her to a window. She said things were starting to look really bad, but right when the kids needed to, the bus showed up. The camp's groundskeeper, this big burly guy whose name was Grigor, ended up driving the camp's bus right up to the burning dorm, so it was running lengthways alongside it. It meant the kids had something to break their fall while jumping from the corridor windows, of which there were many. So as soon as the guardians realized what was happening, they told the kids to jump, and they came pouring out to land on top of the bus. Guardians were on the ground too, helping them down when they landed. Some of the kids hit the bus pretty hard and got hurt that way too, but even the ones who bounced or fell had something there to catch them. Mom said that Grigor's quick thinking saved dozens of lives, her own included. And then once the last few kids had jumped on top of the bus, Mom and another guardian jumped too, and just in the nick of time because Mom said that once she had her feet on solid ground, she turned to see the bus was starting to catch fire itself. By dawn, the dorm building was a soaking wet ruin. It took the fire department a while to make it out there, so by the time they arrived, the dorm was pretty much done for. Their trucks were still there by sunup, as were the medics treating injured kids, and the worst of which were laid out on blankets not far from the ruins of their dorm. Parents started showing up worried not long after because you could see the smoke for miles around. But here's where things started getting even darker, because a lot of those parents showed up to a police perimeter with cops telling them to go home and wait for news there. Mom said they wanted to control the flow of information coming in and out, so they showed up fast to stop panic from spreading. Mom helped with the cleanup and then helped set up makeshift hospital tents. But as she worked, she found herself fixated on this one little detail she'd overlooked that previous night. When she ran to the windows and saw the fire for the first time, she remembered seeing someone running for the tree line off in the distance, but then seeing the flames sent her into action, so the image of that figure running off didn't return until later. But even then, it was pretty obvious the fire was no accident. The firefighters found signs of gas or some flammable liquid, which explained the chemical smell Mom had caught early on, And then once it became clear it was arson, the police took over completely. The mom said it was obvious who did it and that the only person with any ill will against the camp was the son of that committee head, who was bitter about not getting his way. And so when the police announced that they'd found the arsonist and that it had been some hermit living a few miles away in the woods, everyone was very surprised. No one even knew that the guy had been living out there, not in all the time the camp had been running, so he'd obviously kept to himself. And then when they said they caught him with a ton of stolen gas cans, the kind used at the camp depot, things made even less sense. We hadn't noticed any fuel going missing, and why would a hermit steal gas if he didn't have anything that ran on it? But as was custom back then, when authorities spoke, people didn't talk back. The hermit was just the raggedy old loner with no one to speak up for him, and so to authorities, it was an open and shut case. They hauled him in, gave him a closed-door trial, and then announced he was going to be executed for 50 counts of attempted murder, with the aggravating factors being that his target was a dorm full of little kids. Not even a month went by. That poor hermit was executed, and then all these bigwigs went around patting themselves on the back, telling everyone that children were safe again. But Mom said that's just what they wanted them to think. The Guardian started hearing rumors about the hermit, stuff like how he was half-blind, could barely walk straight most days. How does a guy like that sneak into a guarded camp, set the dorm on fire, and then run off before anyone could apprehend him? He doesn't, because whoever really set the dorm on fire was running at full speed when my mom saw them, meaning that they were young, fit, and healthy, and not some old hermit. And the cover-up stank, and Mom said the mood got so bad that party officials came around to the camp to personally remind the Guardians that spreading false rumors meant losing their jobs or worse. Mom kept her mouth shut and her head down, but said that inside, she was boiling. After the camp closed for the season, Mom went back to her regular life, but the anger and the nightmares both stuck around. The kids mostly recovered. A few had scars from burns or falls, but all were traumatized by what they went through. Mom carried her own scars too, mental ones, in the form of the knowledge that sometimes justice gets buried under politics. Before she moved to America and once the Soviet Union started collapsing, Mom thought about digging into it more, maybe finding old records or talking to other survivors. She'd always believed it was the committee's head kid who lit the fire and that the hermit was just a convenient scapegoat. Some poor soul who made the perfect patsy, whose secret trial ensured nobody could ask any serious questions in open court. Hearing her tell it like that hit me hard. This wasn't just some story in a book that we read in history class. It was my mom's life, something she lived through and that shaped her into the tough, no-nonsense woman she was. She always made sure that I knew the value of speaking up, even when it might seem scary, because, as she so correctly said, staying quiet lets the bad people get away with things. Many years ago, I got home from work to find my girlfriend, now wife, having dinner in front of the TV. We talked about our days as I made myself some coffee, and then suddenly, the news guy said something about a murder that had taken place close by. A local man had been found dead in his home, having been stabbed just shy of 100 times. The sheer number of wounds had us thinking, Jesus Christ, that poor man. And it was very shocking to have something like that happen in the quiet, relatively crime-free area we lived in. But then they flashed the victim's picture on screen, and as I looked at him and heard his name, I felt the color and blood drain from my face. When my girlfriend asked if I knew the guy, I nodded. I said his name was Ryan. Now, it's not his real name, and he was a counselor at a summer camp that I went to as a child. Now, she knew that I'd been to a camp as a kid, but I'd never told her the story of Ryan and how much he'd affected my life one summer back when I was a child. And then over the next hour or so, I laid it all out for her. And this, in so many words, is what I said. When I was 11 years old, Mom and Dad decided that I was going to summer camp again that year. We moved across the country not long before, so while I wasn't psyched about going to a new place, I was way past the tantrums and I don't want to go phase of my life. And they showed me some pamphlets for this place called Camp Choctaw. Now, it's not its real name, but I thought it sounded cool. And the kids looked like they were having some huge amounts of fun, and the theme was all things Native American, with plenty of archery, making teepees, and weaving dream catchers. During the final week, the camp held a big powwow where all the kids got to make their own headdresses, and the counselors cooked on a barbecue instead of in the cafeteria. I thought it looked awesome, and while making new friends was always nerve-wracking, I was stoked to be heading to Camp Choctaw for a month come summertime. The camp was in a giant clearing out in the middle of the woods with these cool log-style cabins with big porches scattered around. A big open pavilion thing sat in the middle with picnic tables, and further back I could see the cafeteria and what looked like some sort of activities lodge. Now there were also a couple of brightly colored teepees set up near the pavilion, but we were told that they were just a display piece and that no one got to sleep in them. Now that didn't matter to me though. But even without getting to sleep in an actual teepee like a Native American, the place looked awesome. There were already tons of kids running around by the time me and my dad showed up. I could see the counselors too, mostly college-aged guys, but a couple of older men also. And apart from the cook, who seemed kind of grouchy, they all seemed like really fun dudes. All the younger guys were wearing bandanas or beads and stuff like that, and I remember this blonde dude came over to my dad's car with this big smile like, "Hey buddy, you ready for the best week ever?" Then as we're getting out of the car, he asked, "What's your name?" "My name's Ryan." That was my first meeting with him, and never in a million years did I imagine things would end the way they did. But life is strange sometimes like that, I guess. Now, after I said goodbye to my dad, I joined the other kids, and then eventually I heard my name being called by one of the counselors. I joined a big group of boys and being herded over towards the main lodge where the head counselor, a taller, older man, told us that we were all in cabin 4 and that our group name was the Wolves. Now, we followed him down this little path through the trees where we were met by an awesome log cabin with a big wooden wolf carved over the door. Now, it smelled like bug spray and cleaning fluid. And then as we all piled in and started picking bunks, I remember this skinny kid with messy brown hair and a dinosaur shirt coming up to me and asking if he can take the one above mine. Now, I told him, "Sure, dude," trying to sound nonchalant even though I was pretty nervous. And then over the next half hour or so, we got to know each other a little. Now, by the time the counselor came in to give us a little orientation speech, Tommy and I were already sitting on the floor together, sharing snacks while laughing about how this one kid looked like a burrito when all zipped up in his sleeping bag. Now, that first night, we all stayed up way too late, planning out all the cool stuff we were going to do in these whispers. And then for the next 3 weeks or so, Tommy and I became best friends. Now, whether it was making clay pots, being partners in 3-legged races, or finding sneaky ways to help ourselves to some extra s'mores, Tommy and I did it together. It felt like it was going to be the best summer of my whole life, and that me and Tommy were going to be best buddies till the day we died. And then one day, about midway through the second week, I woke up in the middle of the night to find Tommy gone from his bunk. I needed to use the bathroom, really bad too, so my first thought after my eyes opened was bathroom. But as I got up, that's when I noticed Tommy's bunk was empty. I figured he'd also gone to take a leak, so I walked out of the cabin thinking that I'd bump into him or see him on the way or whatever. But on the walk to the bathroom, I didn't see Tommy, and neither was he in the bathroom when I walked inside there. Now I'm thinking, that's weird. And then after taking a whiz and washing up, I walked out into the night again to sort of whisper Tommy's name, like, "Tommy! Tommy!" At first, there was nothing but silence, and so I kept going towards the pavilion near where the teepees were and kept on calling out for Tommy. Now, it felt creepy as hell being out there all alone after dark, then right as I'm thinking I should maybe just go back to my dorm, I hear this low, eerie whine, almost like an animal, but different. It sent literal chills through me, and while I somehow managed to keep quiet, I sprinted back to my cabin and jumped in my bunk, waking everyone up in my cabin in the process and severely pissing them off. They asked me what was wrong, but when I said, "There's something out there," they listened for just a second before being like, "No, there isn't, dumbass. Go back to sleep." No, it might sound weird, but being shamed like that actually did calm me down. If my cabin mates weren't freaked out, then it was most likely just my imagination getting the better of me. I also realized I was scared Tommy was headed home early for some reason, like he'd gone off to the nurse with some illness in the middle of the night and was on his way to the hospital or something, with me none the wiser. But then in the morning, and much to my relief, there was Tommy, lying in his bunk like the previous night's strangeness was nothing but a weird dream. I was majorly relieved to see him, but since the other kids had also noticed he was missing, it wasn't just me who wanted to know where he'd gone. But when asked, Tommy told us that he'd gone over to the counselor's bathroom for a dump, instead of using the gross one that we all shared. I didn't just buy it. It was like, that boy's a genius, because that shared outhouse thing was nasty as hell. But after we were all done being like, "The hell didn't we think of that?" I told Tommy about the weird noise that I heard outside. I said it sounded like an animal, but that it also had this kind of creepy familiarity to it. And Tommy just looked at me blankly for a second and then said that he hadn't heard anything during the walk to the counselor's place, or on the way back again. But then, and I know this might sound weird, I couldn't tell if he was serious or not. Tommy had pulled a few pranks on me over the previous few weeks, enough that I got an idea when he was lying or not, and when he told me that he didn't hear anything, he couldn't hold eye contact. And I asked him once if he was sure, and then when he insisted, I changed the subject and jokingly suggested that there was a vampire or werewolf running around camp after dark. Tommy played along and laughed, but something just felt off. I figured maybe he was tired and hoped that he wasn't coming down with something that would result in him going home early. We kind of dawdled behind as we're talking, with all the other kids filing past us on their way to breakfast. And then just after I cracked the joke about the vampires or werewolves, a counselor I called Todd came over to usher us along. Now Todd was friendly enough, but you know when you just sort of get a bad feeling about someone when you're a kid? Yeah, that. He just seemed kind of fake, like he was always right on the cusp of his patience wearing thin, at which point he'd drop the cool counselor act and revert to his natural douchebag-like state. Now he came over saying, "Hey guys, everything all right?" But before I could even answer, Tommy was making a beeline for the cafeteria. Now I remember thinking, dude, wait up, in my head, but while I didn't strictly like Counselor Todd, I couldn't exactly just go walking off without answering him. So I was kind of glued to the spot thinking, damn it, now I gotta talk to him. I basically lied and told him everything was fine, and then he told me to catch up with the others. But then as I'm walking off, Todd asked if I needed someone to take me to the bathroom. I was 11, dude, not like 4. No one had asked me if I wanted them to take me to the bathroom since I was back in diapers. But again, this dude's an authority figure, so I'm not rude to him. I'm just thinking, no thanks, Todd, I'm good. I was actually kind of mad when I caught up with Tommy. I mean, not like mad, but I was still saying, dude, why the hell did you just leave me with that weirdo? He told me he was hungry and just wanted to get to the cafeteria, but I could tell that wasn't it. I got so frustrated that I asked him pretty loudly what the hell had gotten into him, only to be immediately warned by one of the counselors to keep my cool. I ended up apologizing to Tommy after breakfast, saying I didn't mean to yell at him, but that's when he offered his own apology and told me how I was kinda right. Something was bothering him, so much it was making him feel sick, so sick that he didn't want to eat. And it was true, all he'd done was push his food around on his plate, and this was after telling me he was so hungry he abandoned me to Todd. But when it came to telling me exactly what was bothering him, Tommy wouldn't say. I had to assume it was some kind of medical thing, because why the hell else would he just be going to call his mom and dad and ask if they'd come get him the next morning? I practically begged him not to go, and to wait and see how he felt later that day. But Tommy was adamant. He felt awful and he needed to go home. Now, I was devastated, but after going through the stages of grief over the course of about an hour, I just landed on acceptance. I put on a happy face and then tried to make sure Tommy's final day at camp was a good one. And while I was kind of successful in that front, the rest of that day was still kind of awkward. Tommy never did get his spark back. He was just too preoccupied with something, and I figured it was my job to just be a good friend and distract from it as best I could. But since Tommy was down, I was down too, so it wasn't long before Counselor Ryan, the guy who first greeted me when I arrived at the camp, came over to see what was up. Ryan was pretty much everyone's favorite counselor and had this total big brother vibe about him. He was good at sports, definitely had that jock feel about him, but at the same time he was warm, approachable, and made sure no one felt left out or ignored. I really looked up to the guy, so when he came around and asked if everything with me and Tommy was okay, he'd also seen me yelling at Tommy, I basically poured my heart out. I said he was acting weird, that he wanted to go home and that something was bothering him, but he wouldn't tell me what. Ryan then gave me what could have been a movie monologue saying I was a good friend, Tommy was lucky to have me, and that everything would turn out just fine if I acted with integrity and always told the truth. Now, 11-year-old me ate that up, especially coming from Ryan, and then the rest of the days seemed that little bit brighter. And like I said, Tommy was much quieter than usual, so after dinner there was no staying up late and whispering between bunks. But then for a second night in a row, when I woke up in the middle of the night to go take a pee, Tommy was not in his bunk. Now that time I knew that I wouldn't see him on the way to the bathroom. That's not where he was going, but as I was creeping through the darkness outside, calling out Tommy's name somewhere between a yell and a whisper, I heard that skin-crawling, high-pitched whine again. It scared the hell out of me, but I didn't run that time. I stayed silent and still, waited to hear it again, and then realized it was coming from the teepees near the pavilion. I crept towards them, then heard the whining sound a third time, only on that occasion I heard a grown man say something like, "Shush." It was definitely coming from inside one of the teepees, and although I was scared out of my mind, my desire to help Tommy spurred me forward. I almost wasn't surprised to see him when I opened up that teepee, but I was surprised to see Counselor Todd in there with him, and I was especially surprised to see Todd standing there, wearing nothing but socks. I was so shocked I dropped the tent flap, and then went running off towards the counselor's cabins, only to find that none other than Counselor Ryan was headed towards me. You can imagine how relieved I was to see him, right? How he might as well have been Superman walking over to save the day. Well, imagine that feeling and double it. When he asked me what was wrong, I told him Tommy and Counselor Todd were in the teepee together, and at first Ryan was just like, "Okay, and?" But then I was obviously like, Todd is naked in there." But instead of being horrified or even asking me to clarify what I'd said because he couldn't believe his ears, Ryan just said, "That's cool, buddy. Me and you can go have some grown-up fun too if you want." I'd never smelled alcohol in anyone's breath before. Not like I did then, anyway. My dad only ever drank beer, and only after me and my sister had gone to bed. But even today, that smell brings me back to that dark night at Camp Choctaw, and the horror I felt after Counselor Ryan asked me to join him. It was me who couldn't believe what I just heard, not just because of what it entailed, but because I'd never had anyone talk to me like that before. All I could do was stand there, dumbstruck with horror, until Ryan reached out and tried to take me by the arm. And that's when my soul returned to my body, I guess, and his touch had me recoiling like his fingers were made of hot coals. I couldn't bring myself to scream. I don't know why, but I just couldn't. I felt like I was in a dream. I didn't want people to know what had happened, and I mean, not at first anyway. So I just ran back to my bunk, curled up against my sleeping bag and just laid there for hours. Trapped in this waking nightmare of reliving what happened over and over in my head. And by the time morning rolled around and the head counselor came over to speak with me about that previous night, I couldn't bring myself to talk about it. I couldn't even look at Tommy, who by then had walked past me with his bag towards the counselor's building, where he was due to be picked up by his parents. And I couldn't bring myself to look at Counselor Ryan either, not as the head said he heard that I had a bad dream. I just nodded along. Yeah, sorry for scaring everybody. And it was twice as horrific because I suddenly found myself where Tommy was, or still was, trapped in this cage of not being able to talk about it for what were a bunch of different reasons. Fear, shame, disgust, you name it. I then did the same thing as Tommy and lied that I was feeling so sick that I needed my parents. And I had to wait until the afternoon for Dad to get there, but he didn't need much convincing when I talked to him over the phone. I guess he could hear it in my voice, that fear and shame and disgust that I mentioned. Fathers know their sons like that, then almost as soon as we're on the highway and Camp Choctaw was in the rear window, I broke down crying. Telling my mom and dad about what happened was easier than I thought it would be, I guess because of that safety I felt. But the thing that had me bursting into tears over and over was the thought of Tommy having to tell his parents what happened, because he was obviously in a way worse situation. Now, we had swapped phone numbers long before we both left camp, so I was able to give Tommy's number to my father, and he contacted Tommy's parents immediately, and I remember feeling as if everything was going to be fine. Dad was going to fix everything, and in that omnipotent parental way that seems like magic to kids who don't know how the world works yet. I remember Mom hugging me, and the mute sound of Dad's voice while he talked on the phone in his office. He was in there for a while, but when he came out, I figured everything had been fixed. But I was wrong. Dad came back into my bedroom and in so many words asked me, tactfully, if I made the whole thing up. He didn't outright accuse me of lying because I think he knew that I believed something had happened to Tommy, but when he put the same thing to Tommy's parents and they asked their son, he denied everything. I couldn't believe it at the time. And now it makes all the sense in the world to me, but in the moment, I couldn't understand why Tommy would be cool with the counselors not being punished for what they did to him. I tried telling my dad that it was Tommy who was lying, which made everything all the worse because it was like me versus him by that point. I knew he'd hate me for trying to tell the truth when all he wanted to do was move on and pretend it never happened, but I couldn't just stay quiet. Sometimes I wonder if I should have just moved on and forgotten about it instead of turning a whole year of my life into this slow nightmare with no end in sight. But as they used to say to knights back in the day, always tell the truth, even if it leads to your death. At least that's what I tell myself to keep the doubt and regret at bay. Dad didn't give up. He and Mom believed me, and they even said years later that what Tommy and his parents said didn't wash. They said it was that classic sort of victim in denial thing, whereas I was able to talk about it because I hadn't actually been violated. Dad was the one who adopted the whole thing as like his own personal cause, one he'd fight to the bitter end. And while that might sound like a nice thing to say, the reality of that bitter end left an even more bitter taste. Regardless of whether Tommy was going to tell the truth or not, Dad got in touch with the cops and relayed everything I'd said to them. That kicked off this whole investigation side of things, and I had to go talk to some police lady for hours in some cozy, colorful family room, which was supposed to make me feel safe and comfortable. Well, it didn't work, and I had a major panic attack when I got to the part where Ryan made a move on me. I only cried when I described seeing Tommy in the teepee with Todd. It made me feel sick to my stomach, but I was able to talk about it with her. But then once I got to the Ryan part, it was like I was right there again, standing in the dark and smelling the booze on his breath and All I wanted to do was run. When it was all over, I'd given my statement in full. Everyone kept telling me how brave I'd been and how everything was going to be just fine. But, and just like with Ryan's little movie monologue speech, that was a lie too. I didn't know what was coming, and no one took the time to warn me either. I guess because how the hell do you even explain a thing like that to an 11-year-old? Sit them down and say, oh, by the way, no one's going to believe you, and there's going to be a huge campaign to make us out to be crazy liars to try and scam a summer camp out of their hard-earned cash. Nah, they wouldn't understand, and so no one tried. The first I heard of any pushback, Dad was screaming at Mom in the kitchen one day when I got home from a friend's. Their mom gave me a ride, and when I walked inside, I thought Dad was mad at Mom for some reason, but he wasn't. He was mad at something he read in the paper. According to some reporter, Camp Choctaw had conducted a full and thorough investigation of their counselor's conduct, and had concluded that no wrongdoing whatsoever had taken place. They welcomed any kind of police investigation and claimed they'd fully cooperate, but when push came to shove, there just wasn't enough evidence or testimony without Tommy. And the more my dad pushed them to change their mind, the harder they pushed back. Then in the end, the cops said if he didn't leave them alone, he'd be charged with harassment. We had to basically hold out hope that Tommy was going to change his mind, tell the truth, and allow us to bring both a lawsuit against Camp Choctaw and charges against its counselors. But while we're waiting, the wave of negative stories hit. Someone wrote into one of the papers claiming to be a relative of an accused counselor and basically saying we were liars trying to extort Camp Choctaw. The story even made it on the air when some talk show host ran a phone-in about it. Some people fought in our corner, saying the police ought to do more to encourage victims to come forward, but others said all kinds of crazy stuff about us, like how my dad had only taken a dislike to Camp Choctaw because it revered native culture and taught respect for those that came before. I cannot overemphasize what complete nonsense that was, and I also can't overemphasize how furious it made my dad. But not just furious either. He got legitimately depressed over it. He drank more, he took time off of work because of the stress, and it was a terrible time for everyone involved, but I guess none more so than Tommy. He ended up moving out of state with his family. We got no warning. Me and him never spoke again after we climbed into our bunks on that last night of camp. And we heard it through the newspaper when someone wrote about how the silent witness, as they called him, had moved on for good. My family ended up moving too, mostly because Dad had his reputation absolutely shredded in the media, with a pretty prominent columnist calling him a racist who'd ruin his own son's life in the hopes of lining his pockets. He's had a personal prejudice against reporters ever since, at least certain kinds, and to be honest, I can't blame him either. If the media had taken our side, things might have ended up way different. I think that's what would have pushed Tommy to make the right decision and made sure the people that hurt him got what's coming to them. But whatever chance he had of changing his mind will have been snuffed out the first time he heard about the counter-accusations, saying how we were being coached by our parents so they could pocket some cash. Now, the whole thing probably marks the sorest and lowest point of my entire life, and although me and Tommy might not be able to get justice anymore, it doesn't mean no one can. I guess the whole point of telling this story all these years later is to tell people how, if stuff like this happens, you need to talk about it. Even if you get called a liar and people say the worst stuff imaginable about you, you can't give up. Not just because you owe it to yourself, but because you owe it to the other victims too. The ones who weren't able to get justice for themselves and punishment for their abusers. Keep talking. Time is on your side, and as the old saying goes, lies run sprints, but the truth runs marathons. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember to cake fart on your birthday. In the quiet corners of southern Russia, a respected youth leader named Anatoly Slivko lived a life that seemed devoted to discipline and mentorship. But behind closed doors, something far darker was unfolding. Over years, he filmed his private rituals in secrecy, constructing a hidden world fueled by obsession and control. When the truth surfaced, it revealed a nightmare concealed beneath ordinary routine, a reminder that sometimes the most disturbing horrors are the ones carefully recorded, frame by frame, in silence. Listen to the full story right now over on my true crime channel, Saturn Soul, link down below. Now enjoy the stories. I grew up in a group home in the Midwest. My foster parents tried, but I hit the road once I turned 18. Now, I worked my way across the country, moving from place to place once I had enough cash in my pocket from working odd jobs. But of all the weird jobs I worked, from fish processor to theme park security, the strangest one of all was up in Alaska, where I worked as a projectionist at a small-town movie theater. Now, I first landed in Anchorage in 1998 and then ended up trekking across the interior to see all Alaska had to offer. I ended up in Fort Yukon for a while, then after heading out about 45 miles northwest, I came to a little town called Venati. It's deep in Indian country, and the tribal government out there was fiercely independent and proud of it. And when you see where they live, you understand why they're so protective over it. I saw more top-tier hunting and fishing spots out there than any other place in America, all surrounding a town of about 180 people, give or take. Now, there are no roads going in or out of town, so you either get there by plane or by trail, or not at all. And then, since the grocery stores run out of stuff pretty quick, a lot of folks live hand-to-mouth either by rifle or rod. There's a lot of wood stoves to save money in the winters, and Lord knows they need them out there. But while we weren't so far north that we got those endless days and nights at either end of the year, we got some killer northern light shows, especially in the deep winter. Venati Village is maybe 95% native, but there's about half a dozen outsiders, mostly from the lower 48, who, like me, ended up landing there one way or another. I remember bumming around for a while just getting to know the place and its tribal culture. And then one day, I got word that the projectionist at the old movie theater was throwing in the towel, and someone was needed to take his place. Now, I didn't know squat about working a projector, but since the pay was decent and no one else was stepping up to the plate on account of how boring it was supposed to be, I figured, why the hell not? Now, I'd really taken a liking to Venati, so I was glad to be sticking around, but I quickly figured out why no one had jumped at the chance to do that job. First off, the movie theater was just a huge semi-soundproof shed with a projectionist platform at the back and a bunch of old church pews and folding chairs to make up the rows of seating. There was no actual heating in there, so aside from an old space heater which just about stopped the whole theater from freezing over, you had to wrap up warm and maybe bring a little vodka if you wanted to get through the night. And then secondly, the library of reels they had was nothing short of abominable. There were a lot of old reels from the 50s and 60s, and not the good ones either. There was one titled The Robot versus the Aztec Mummy, about a mad scientist who had to construct a combat droid to fight off an evil Aztec mummy he accidentally awakened. And then a movie called Earth versus the Spider, which is pretty much what you imagine it to be. The movies were terrible, but no one really cared, and every Saturday night you'd get at least a dozen younger men with beers just hanging out and making fun of whatever crap movie I decided to show. They'd seen all of them 100 times too, so much that they were yelling out lines along with the actors and mimicking the action whenever the robot and mummy were fighting, or when the cops were trying to kill the spider with a whole bunch of DDT. It was one of their only forms of entertainment, a place friends hung out, a place parents could drop their kids off for a couple of hours whenever the family-friendly stuff was playing on a Sunday. And that means a lot to some of them, and I felt they deserved better. I started a small grassroots campaign, raised a little money for the theater, and then started calling around places in Anchorage and Fairbanks, seeing if anyone had any old movie reels they wanted to part with. Sometimes I'd get a whole bunch of stuff, mostly more of the same bad movies from decades ago, but at least they were new. In one box I got Attack of the Eye Creatures and The Day the Earth Froze, and all the Saturday night moviegoers were thrilled to be able to make fun of a brand new, terrible movie. People actually started showing up to see some of the quote-unquote premieres I'd host, and then as revenue went up, I could afford to fix up the theater a little until the whole thing became sort of like a personal project to me and brought me more joy than I ever thought possible. At least until one night, after closing, when I was going through a box of reels that I got from Fairbanks I hadn't inventoried yet, and I came across an unlabeled can that looked a little different than the rest. It's past midnight, and I was getting pretty tired, but I guess curiosity got the better of me. And so I opened the can, hooked the reel up to the projector, and then hit the motor after shutting off the lights. I'm expecting a title sequence of some kind, even just a vanity plate to let me know who made the movie, but there's nothing like that at all. The film just sort of flashed into life, no sound at all, showing maybe 4 or 5 flaming torches surrounding a big old tree. There was a jump cut, and then to my shock, I saw a masked man with no clothes on start walking around the tree. I say mask, but it was more like a kind of helmet almost. I couldn't make out much detail right then because of the distance between him and the camera, but I could see that there was a part covering his face and hair, and then a whole bunch of sticks or twigs sticking out of the back like they were hair or a mane or something. He was circling the tree, naked from the neck down, and from the way he was moving his arm, it looked like he was dousing the bark of the tree in some kind of fluid. I might be wrong, and he was just kind of waving whatever was in his hand in its direction, but either way it looked almost ceremonial. I figured that I must have been watching somebody's home movie and that whoever had filmed it was into some pretty freaky stuff. Turns out, that wasn't even the half of it, because after the naked guy finished this little lap around the tree, there was another jump cut, and after a brief moment of seeing nothing but the trees and those flaming torches, a whole bunch of people came walking into frame. The one I'd seen previously was in the lead, and as he walked towards the tree again from off camera, 3 similarly undressed men guided another into the frame. Now this man was naked too, but unlike the men guiding him, who were also wearing wooden helmet masks, this man's head was bare, and he was also showing a great deal of difficulty in walking. Now it was like he'd either been drugged or was drunk out of his mind, but either way, he didn't seem to protest as the masked men urged him forward. And then when they got him in the trunk, they turned him around and then started tying what looked like rope around his wrists. The guy wasn't struggling at all. He didn't fight back. He just let 2 of the men tie each of his wrists before they walked around the tree out of sight, where they presumably tied the ropes together to hold the man in place. You could kind of see him wobbling in place, but he didn't try to escape, and that's what really put me on guard and left me completely unprepared for what was about to come. There appeared to be another jump cut because after the maskless man's arms were tied, the shot suddenly changed so that one of the masked men was standing in front of them while the others were kneeling in a line closer to the camera. In all the other shots, the maskless man was still but kind of wobbly, whereas in this latest shot, he looked like he was struggling against the ropes. I couldn't see him very well thanks to the guy standing in front of him, but I could see enough to know that he was sort of pulling and tugging on the ropes, trying to get himself free, but he couldn't. The next thing, the man in front starts hitting him. At least it looked like he was hitting him. He did that over and over while the tied man struggled until suddenly, the struggling stopped completely. I thought he might have knocked the guy out or something because you could see him go kind of limp against the tree with only the ropes holding him up. But then, the man in the front stepped out of the way, and what I saw shocked me so much I almost fell out of my chair. The man tied to the tree, the one who'd been wobbly, then still, then struggling, had been mutilated. The naked man with the mask started gesturing to the bloody mess, and the tree-kneeling men started going wild, waving their arms and looking up to the sky. And then the standing man stepping towards the tied one, and from what I could tell, it looked like he started to almost reach into the guy's body. And that was all I could watch, and in a sort of half panic, I turned off the projector and the theater went dark again. I think I sat there for a minute or two in total shock, wondering if what I'd seen was even real. As something of a movie buff, I knew all too well that a clever director could fake something like that, and with those jump cuts being so obvious, I kept telling myself it was all clever editing and special effects. But what I couldn't make sense of was just how convincing the victim had been. How they must have been a damn fine actor to pull off that kind of performance. I also couldn't figure out how the filmmaker managed to get hold of such a convincing prop, because when he stepped away from that butchered body, I hadn't seen anything that realistic in all my movie-watching life. I kept telling myself it wasn't real, that it couldn't have been real. But of all the dumb movie deaths I'd seen and all the dumb movies I'd watched over the past couple of months, nothing prompted that sort of intense, physical reaction in me like seeing that butchered man tied to that tree. I knew I had to do something, even if I took it to the cops who told me it was nothing but an amateur horror movie and I got myself into a panic over nothing, because I'd rather be wrong and relaxed than keep on wondering what the hell I'd just witnessed. And the next morning, I went to talk with Pete, Venetai's VPSO, which stands for Village Public Safety Officer. And these are the folks to assist state troopers in policing the more remote villages, and since he obviously couldn't help the situation much, Pete told me to head into Fairbanks and talk to the troopers there. My next stop was to talk with one of the pilots who flew a daily air taxi down to Fairbanks. Passengers only paid a small fare to cover the pilot's pay, and the fuel came out of the tribal taxation fund so that everyone could afford to get to Fairbanks for all that kind of stuff. And this meant all I needed to do was buy a ticket, wait for the next flight, and then an hour later we were landing in Fairbanks. I was hungry, and I had a bunch of stuff I needed to do while I was there, but all that needed to wait until I'd stopped by the state trooper building. The guy I talked to said anything that happened up in Indian country was covered by the Rural Services Unit, and if I didn't mind waiting, he could get one of their 2 RSU troopers back to headquarters so I could talk with him. And that was how I met a trooper named Sheldon Yazzie. Yazzie was a great big bear of a man with tan skin, dark eyes, and one heck of a hairline too. He wore a black mustache and goatee, and he wore them well too, but he also had this smile that lit up the room and made me instantly feel at ease, even with that movie reel sitting in my backpack. I asked him if we could talk in private, so he walked me into the tiny rural services office that he had there. Then after taking a seat, I took that reel out and told him what was on it. As you can imagine, he lost that bright smile of his as I went over what I saw. I told him how I could tell from the quality of the recording that it had to be at least 20 years old, and there was no sound to go with it, so I didn't hear any names or voices. But he agreed that if it was real, then it sure as hell needed to be investigated. And since I didn't have a phone where I was staying, Yazzie said that he'd call the Venetai Tribal Council building if he had any updates for me. And then after shaking his hand, I went about my business in Fairbanks and then flew back up to Venetai late in the afternoon. I checked back in with Pete, the village public safety officer that I mentioned before, telling him all about handing that reel over as evidence. We still didn't know where it came from and only roughly when it was made, so we each decided it was best to keep quiet about me finding it and simply wait for a call from Yazzie to find out what the state troopers had to say. And then a few days later, one of the staff from the village council came over to the movie theater and said I had a call waiting from the cops over in Fairbanks. I know I must have turned a few heads running all the way across the road, but I didn't want to keep Trooper Yazzie waiting, and I also figured that it was too soon to have cracked the case, but I assumed that he might have something for me. But unfortunately on that part I was wrong. Yazzie said he and his superior had the displeasure of watching the reel together on a projector they borrowed from someone. And then by the time it had finished, every state trooper in the building was packed into that dark conference room with their eyes glued to what was happening on that big white wall in front of them. They were horrified, as they should have been, and their first port call was the Fairbanks junk shop that I sourced the box of reels from. Unsurprisingly, the owner apparently had nothing to do with the crimes and couldn't even remember where in the heck the reel had come from. He said people call by to drop stuff off and pick things up all the time, with some coming as far as Delta Junction or Grant Creek. There was no way he'd be able to ID the person who brought it in, and since there were no security cameras around his store, there was no going through it to figure out who did. They did get a couple of clues, though. Not much, but it was something. First off, the tree the victim was tied to was ID'd as a white spruce, the most common kind of tree in Alaska's uplands. White spruce are also common around the Great Lakes in New England, but since the reel apparently came from Fairbanks, there was a really good chance that the reel had been filmed in Alaska. Now, the reel wasn't manufactured in Canada, but it was made back in the mid-70s, which not only lined up with the time I figured it was filmed, but also lined up with a couple of people going missing from Anchorage and the surrounding towns over the course of about 4 or 5 years. I remember feeling my stomach drop as I realized what Trooper Yazzie was saying, that some goddamned murder cult had been operating around Anchorage in the 70s, and that what we'd seen might have constituted just one of half a dozen separate murders. The only prints they were able to pull off the can were that of the junk shop owner and another set of unidentified prints that they assumed were mine. Yazzie asked if I minded stopping by the Fairbanks AST building next time I was in town so I could be fingerprinted. I did as he asked, and the prints were confirmed to be mine. Now, while I was there, I asked Yazzie where'd they go from there, like if they had any way of chasing up leads or tracking down clues, and his response was disappointing to say the least. I know they had nothing to go on in terms of who was doing the killing in that home movie, but I'd really hoped that chasing up serial numbers and whatnot would yield results. And so when I was basically told, keep ordering boxes of reels and keep us updated if you find anything else, I'm thinking, wait, it's down to me to go hunting for other reels? And that's not what Yazzie was asking me. It sure as hell felt like it at the time, but that's not what he was asking. They just figured that rather than put all the time and resources into sourcing every unlabeled film can in Alaska, it'd be better to just circulate word of what they'd found and hope someone, somewhere, found something. Trooper Yazzie had been really helpful on the phone, and I knew it wasn't his call to just do nothing about the home movie murder, but I was still hugely frustrated at the response by the state troopers. I guess it wasn't even their fault either, because they had superiors to deal with, and it was probably them that determined there wasn't enough to warrant a full, funded investigation. At least not until they had more than one reel and more than exactly 0 avenues of investigation they had at that moment. And so while I did kind of resent having to do it, I went into overdrive in terms of sourcing movie reels from places, calling as far as Anchorage, but also Vancouver and Seattle to see what I could get my hands on. I received more shipments of reels brought in by the Venetai air taxi than I ever had before, but even after months and months of searching and sourcing, I didn't find a single other unlabeled reel, let alone one with similar contents as the first. I had to wait years, literally years, before I came across another unlabeled film can, but when I did, even with all that time having passed, it was like I could feel the color draining from my face. It was the spring of 1999 when I found that first can of film, and I didn't find the second until late summer of 2001. But the moment I set eyes on it, I practically ran to the projector, hooked up the film, and fired up the motor after turning the lights out. There was that same long wait before any picture showed up, not title cards or vanity plates or anything like that, and I found myself both hoping it was from the same people, while at the same time hoping it was just nothing. But then the second I saw flaming torches flash onto the screen, lighting up the dark night around them, I knew it was from the same sick bastards who made that first tape I saw. The torches weren't surrounding a tree this time. They were all lined up on either side of what looked to be a huge teepee made of hundreds of wooden sticks. There were 2 more torches by the entrance, and just guessing, that thing must have been maybe 15 feet tall and just as wide. It was no small construction, and then as I'm looking at it, wondering just how long it'd take to put something like that together, there's a jump cut, and another one of those naked guys appears wearing one of those wooden helmet things. He walks up to the opening of the huge stick-made teepee thing, and then, after picking up one of the torches, he walks inside and starts lighting the inner walls on fire. I could see the orange glow pick up in the darkness as the flames took, turning the dark inside of the teepee this terrible orange. And I figured the guy'd walk out slowly, just as slowly as he walked in, but he didn't move. There was a jump cut and more of the teepee was on fire, the flames rising as the sticks caught, and the thing started to burn in earnest. And then at the same time, what I believed to be the same 3 figures as the first movie came walking to the shot, each wearing the same thing as the last time. I could see the guy who lit the teepee on fire, standing perfectly still inside of it, still holding his torch. There must have been quite a lot of smoke and heat in that thing too, but the guy didn't seem to move a muscle. And seconds later, the 3 approaching figures each filled into the teepee's interior along with him. There was another jump cut, showing the teepee all the way up in flames, and again I could clearly see all 4 figures inside of it. They must have been roasting alive in there, but they didn't seem to be moving a muscle. And then just as I started to wonder if what I was seeing was real, there was another cut to show the teepee collapsing in a shower of flames and sparks. I showed Pete the VPSO, and while he seemed shocked at first, watching those freaky-looking nudists walking into the burning teepee, he had the same reaction I did at one of those final jump cuts. He asked how he could be sure that those dudes were still inside once it was really burning, and how they might have used a little clever editing to make it look like they were. And he made a great point, and my first thoughts involved them faking their own deaths or something along those lines to throw the cops off their trail. Pete said that was impossible, but we still couldn't rule anything out, and the most important thing was getting the can of film to the state troopers in Fairbanks. Again, I thought the cops might be able to get some kind of clue from that reel. Like maybe they'd gotten reports of other huge sick teepees like that so they could sort of, I don't know, triangulate the place that they were operating out of. Now I knew that they could track serial numbers, check shipments, and all that kind of stuff, so once again I found myself hoping my contribution might crack this case. But as it turned out, handing that tape over did way more harm than good. Yazzie explained how his superiors had reacted much the same as we had to all those sudden jump cuts towards the end of the footage, and instead of going with my theory that the whole thing was meant to confuse law enforcement, they started openly questioning whether the whole thing was even legitimate at all. Yazzie said one senior trooper suggested it was some film school kid's home movie horror show, and that the whole thing had been a huge waste of time. Besides, even if both movies were real, the second one didn't show any crime but open burning, which for first-timers is nothing but a misdemeanor without the proper permit. And at best, it could be used to tie the men to any of the other crimes that might occur into the future, but without a positive ID on the victim from the first movie, there was nowhere for them to go and nothing for them to do. The burning teepee was just another dead end. Trooper Yazzie said that one trooper floated the idea that it was me who'd made those movies. Fake them, I mean, and scaring folks with them was how I got my kicks. Now, it was only Trooper Yazzie arguing that I didn't seem the type that stopped them flying up to Venati to search where I was staying and have a talk with me. And while I appreciate him fighting my corner in that respect, I was mad as hell at them for making out that I was just some prankster and not someone just honestly trying to help out. Now, once again, there was no real inventory at the thrift store that I purchased the reel from, as once again it came in a set of around 24 old movie reels. The state troopers didn't even pay the place a visit that time, they just called to make sure that there was no record, meaning for all intent and purpose, the tape could have been my own creation and I was just lying about where it had come from. Yazzie was just as frustrated as I was, but he wasn't surprised. He said Alaska has more unsolved disappearances than any other place in America, so much that people don't even bother looking sometimes. If a kid goes missing in a park or something, that tends to be a big deal. But a grown man, especially someone from the outer states who's not very experienced in the outdoors, people just tend to think, they're a goner, and move on. It's a harsh way to look at things, I guess, but just like Yazzie said, people have found way too many skeletons surrounded by bear scat to have hopes someone might still be out there, especially after they've been missing for more than a few days. He said the best we could hope for is that some more of those reels showed up and that they'd showed victims, perps, and locations in more detail, and that's even assuming that there were other victims and that wasn't just the end of the trail right there. I ended up going on another ordering spree, sourcing unlabeled reels and boxes of junk from all over Alaska and the Pacific Northwest, and one time I was awake a whole 24 hours burning through unlabeled cans of film, stuck in that limbo of hoping that I'd get lucky, while praying that there weren't any more of those horrifying home movies out there. And then before long, I realized what it was doing to me. My little quest for justice had turned into some blind obsession, and my work at the movie theater was starting to suffer as a result. Now, I'd think about those masked and naked maniacs all goddamn day, and then when I go to bed at night, I'd dream about them too. I started to lose sleep, and I stopped eating. The reels became an obsession, and just about everyone around me could see it too. Pete and the support officer recognized it first, I guess, and told me that maybe, just maybe, my time in Venetai had come to an end and it was time to move on. And I guess he was right. Last time I stayed anywhere for almost 3 years, I was a kid of single-digit ages being raised by a foster family. And maybe that was it. I come to the end of my time, and that obsession of mine was just a way of my conscience kind of rebelling against putting down roots. I moved on down to Anchorage, and then with the skills that I picked up in Venetai, I ended up working as a projectionist at a much more professional operation. But there's not a day that goes by where I don't think about those unlabeled film cans, and I don't think I'll ever be able to forget the horrors they contained. I grew up in western Georgia, and for as long as I can remember, I always wanted to be a pilot. I thought about the Air Force for a while, mostly for the speed, but the high discipline environment wouldn't have done me any good. But then once I had about 1,500 hours under my belt, I heard about some pretty lucrative opportunities up north. Way north, too. Like in Alaska. I landed in Anchorage back in 2011 with enough money to bum around for a few weeks, enjoying all that seafood and the clean, cool air they got up there. And then while I was at it, I went around knocking on the doors of a few air taxi outfits and asked if they needed any pilots. I figured positions up there would be majorly competitive given the perks of the job, but I found a vacancy at the third place I called, an operation out of Talkeetna, hauling hunters, fishermen, and mail to remote airstrips. I'd be flying some beat-up old Cessna 180 at first, but I could work my way up to bigger and bigger loads. And then as long as I didn't spook the passengers or bend any metal, I was told that there'd always be work for me up in the land of the midnight sun, as they say. And the best thing about my job, by a country mile, was the freedom you got up there. You're basically an independent contractor, so not quite your own boss, but close enough to get all the benefits. And then cruising over all those jagged peaks and glaciers, all God's own artwork, it makes every single flight feel like a brand new adventure. On a clear day, you can spot moose from 500 feet up, with all those puffy white clouds off in the distance looking like floating mountain ranges for miles either side of you. You feel like a real maverick too sometimes, landing on gravel bars or frozen lakes that'd make most spit-shined airline pilots piss their pants. But then there are the downsides, the primary one being the weather. I've never flown anywhere that can turn from a bluebird to a whiteout in a matter of mere minutes. 1 second it's chilly but otherwise a manageable flight, and then the next thing, you're dodging ice like it's taken a deep and personal disliking to you. One bad call on fuel or wind and you're toast. And even if you do somehow manage to land safely in the great American wilderness, you're hiking back to base with a hungry bear on your trail most likely. Because out there, walking with a limp or an open wound is like walking around with a big old sign above your head saying, "Dinner is served." Parts take forever to ship to Alaska from manufacturers, so maintenance is always a pain in the ass. And sometimes it's so lonely out there with nothing but your VHF radio that you actually miss having some babysitter in air traffic control checking in to bother you every couple of minutes. And that kind of brings me around to one of the hairiest scrapes I ever had up there, almost 9 years ago now, back in the early fall of 2017. It was September 6th, a Wednesday to be exact, and I was flying a whole bunch of supplies from Bethel up to a camp near the Yukon River in my old 185 on skis. Oh, and the skis part refers to these hydraulic wheel skis that we use for snowy conditions, because you can't use regular landing gear on a snowpack. Now anyway, the weather brief said marginal VFR, meaning that there was a high risk of encountering low ceilings, fog, and generally poor visibility, particularly in the more mountainous areas. But with ceilings dropping fairly low, I figured that I could at least dodge the very worst of it. Once she was all loaded up, I hopped into my 185 and got her up in the air with no problems. And then for about 40 minutes or so, everything was going just fine as I'm weaving between patches of cloud like I've done 1,000 times before. And then suddenly, my luck ran out, and I was faced with a cloud bank right up in front of me, no dodging it, and it looked as thick as potato soup. It looked like nothing but a whole bunch of rain clouds at first, the kind that are almost filled to bursting with the super cool droplets they get. Now, I thought worst case I'd get a wet windscreen and bad visibility for a minute or two, but then after punching into it and watching almost all the light disappear, my engine started to surge like it was choking, and then it sputtered out altogether. RPM started dropping off, and I grabbed the carb heat up to full before switching fuel tanks, but it was no good. My engine wasn't responding. My instruments are going haywire, and I figured the pitot tube must have been frozen solid because my airspeed's reading 0. And I also heard the telltale vibration of my propellers icing up, which is obviously really bad news because I need them to be able to spin. And the longer I went without engines, the worse the outcome would be. And so it occurs to me that I might have to ditch in the bush, in which case I might as well end up as bear bait. Oh, and it might sound crazy, but we generally don't wear parachutes, as going down with the plane can sometimes be a hell of a lot safer than parachuting into trees or into a mountain. Anyway, my main concern is that I'm about to start augering in, which is basically when a plane starts plummeting to the ground while spinning really fast. Now, my control stick doesn't seem to be responding at all, which should have meant that I was in big trouble and I was about to start free-falling. But when I looked at the altitude, it was holding steady. I remember thinking it was possible that the ice was messing with the static, but just like the gauge suggested, the plane kept sailing along smooth as silk through the clouds. Now, I can't overstate what little sense that made to me, and it wasn't like I was some newbie greenhorn who couldn't interpret my dials and gauges. No engine meant no power meant no propellers, and no propellers meant that I should have been quickly losing altitude. And yet, somehow, I was still cruising along like nothing had happened and my plane was working just fine. Because that seemed impossible, and on the assumption that I was losing altitude, I tried to drop the flaps to slow my bird down. But for some reason, my controls were almost completely unresponsive. The yoke, which is what we call the control stick, was barely budging, but I hadn't been without RPMs for long enough for the hinges on my flaps to be locked up with ice. And that's the point where I really start to panic. I've been nervous from the very start of it, but the fear only hit when I realized that even with what must have been 1,800 flight hours by that point, I had absolutely no idea what was going on. I fell back on my training, feeling myself sweating in spite of the cold as the fear and adrenaline pumped through my blood. I ran through the restart checklist in my head, which is part of our emergency procedures to regain engine power after an in-flight engine failure or a flameout. Now, I'd just about reached the 6th step in ensuring my throttle was slightly open, when out of nowhere, this whole airframe started shaking like a chihuahua taking a dump. I'd never been so scared as I was then when my plane started to shake like that. I mean, shaking is the wrong word. It was more like it was vibrating in midair. It was so rough that I genuinely thought, like, this is it, and that at any moment I was going to watch my plane start to rattle apart at the seams. My whole body was vibrating along with it, and I had to grit my teeth to keep from chattering as I kept hearing the ping, ping, ping of icicles slinging off the prop and pinging against the fuselage. It's hard to overstate just how screwed it seemed I was, and I remember thinking that I was a goddamned fool for listening to all the old salts who told me a parachute just meant a long, slow, and painful death, either freezing up on a mountainside or getting eaten alive by some animal. I'd have given my whole damn nutsack for a parachute in that moment. But then, just as all hope seemed lost and that feeling of despair was set to overwhelm me completely, my plane suddenly broke through the cloud into all clear ahead, and my engine suddenly coughed back to life. The power surged, my controls loosened up, and then after quickly leveling off and checking all of my gauges twice, I think I just about lost my mind for a second. I remember yelling, "Atta girl, there you go baby, there she is," and then laughing my ass off as the engine began to hum all nice and loud again. It was the second greatest feeling of relief and happiness I'd ever felt, second only to the one I felt when my now wife gave birth to a healthy baby girl. I felt like the luckiest son of a bitch to ever grace the skies. But then, knowing my luck must be seriously running dry after such a close call, I used my map to locate the nearest airstrip and then immediately made a beeline for it. I managed to raise someone down there on my radio so they were expecting me when I brought my plane in, and managed to land her with the greasy side down. But when I climbed out and started stumbling over to what passed for the pilot's lounge, my knees were just about knocking together from the adrenaline dump as I trudged through the snow. An older man, who turned out to be an airplane mechanic, came out into the snow to greet me as I got closer. I was so shaken up that I could barely talk, but after getting me inside, pouring me a stiff drink, and then sitting me down in front of a warm fire for a while, I started to feel like my old self again. There was another guy in there who I think was just a friend of the mechanic, and they both sat in stunned silence as I told them what just happened to me. I knew neither of them were pilots, so I tried to make it as clear as possible just how weird it all was, and how I'd never encountered anything like it in all my thousands of hours of flying. But as it turns out, it wasn't the first time either of my two companions had heard of something like that happening to a bush pilot up there. The mechanic said that he was originally from Idaho, and he'd been fixing up light aircraft in Alaska for some 20-odd years, and in his experience, strange stuff like that occurred a lot more than anyone liked to admit. He said as long as he'd been up there, the pilots had been telling him weird stories about all kinds of different stuff, be it seeing strange crafts flying past them at supersonic speeds, or having their aircraft start acting funny when, just like me, they passed through what they thought was just a rain cloud. He said the strangest of the stories come from those who fly at night, how they talk of strange lights in the sky, disappearing from one place and then appearing again in another in the blink of an eye. When they were just about done going over all that strange crap they'd heard over the years, the engineer and his buddy told me that I was lucky to have landed my plane, and that it's not uncommon for pilots to take to the skies only to never to be heard from again. I waited a couple of more hours for the weather to clear, and then I kept on towards my destination with no further problems. But I've never forgotten what happened that day, and sometimes I get a cold sweat seeing a particularly dark set of storm clouds, because if I'm ever unlucky enough to have a second run-in with whatever happened that day, I might end up as one of those pilots that's never heard from again. Longtime listener here from Anchorage, Alaska. And while I spent most of my life down here, I grew up on the far western coast in a place called Point Hope. Living in Point Hope felt like you were living in this frozen bubble at the very edge of the world, far from anything warm, cool, or relevant. It felt like no one else in America knew that we were out there. Heck, even the sun forgets about us for a month each year, and as you can imagine, winters were bad, even for Alaska. Some years the whole town would end up buried under 7-foot snowdrifts, and sometimes the wind would come in so hard off the sea that it wasn't safe to go outside. School would be canceled if it dipped below -40, which happened at least 24 times growing up, and even on the nicer days, we'd bundle up in these giant parkas that made us all look like different colored Kennys from South Park. We build snowmen and snow shelters out in our front yards, or at least try to anyway, because half the time they'd collapse on us and we'd end up having snowball fights till our fingers went numb through our gloves. In terms of demographics, there's a big Inupiaq element in town, so I grew up hearing all kinds of stories from elders about the times that came before. We were told how before the gold rush, people would survive on nothing but seal or caribou meat, and times had changed so much that the Iditarod mushers now rolled through town on fancy sleds made of feather-light alloys instead of the more traditional wood, rope, and tuss. Now, we used to hear some incredible stories of tough hearts and sharp minds, but we also heard a few creepy ones too, and for me, there was none more creepy than the story of what happened to a kindly older elder named Kimmick. Now, back during the time of my grandparents, so the 40s and 50s, Uncle Kimmick, as they called him, lived out on the vast, wide-swept tundra to the east of Point Hope. He was a gentle, middle-aged man whose weathered face told the story of the life he lived, and wherever he went, he'd be wearing his thick fur-lined parka made from caribou hide, and at a time when everyone was wearing fancy, down-insulated coats, he cut a very prominent figure around town. His name meant dog in his language, and while I understand that to be an insult in a lot of cultures, to Uncle Kimmick it was the highest kind of compliment, because his one great love in life were his dogs. Uncle Kimmick was an expert at tending to his team of 8 loyal sled dogs. They were a mix of huskies and malamutes with all sorts of thick coats, loud voices, and boundless energy. He treated each one and every one of them like family and fed them scraps of seal and fish that he hunted, even if it meant that he himself had to sometimes go without. He was a tough man, a survivor, but Uncle Kimmick was also known around Point Hope for being the sweetest old man you could ever hope to meet. He'd stop and talk with people whenever he came into town in a sled, and any trouble you'd had, he'd be there to help mend a fishing net or offer his sage advice on carving ivory. Point Hope's residents didn't see him much during the summertime. He had all the hares, berries, and seagull wine he could drink. Look it up, by the way. But during the long polar nights in the winter time, when the sun disappears for around 31 days, Uncle Kimmick used to mush his dogs into town at least once a week to pick up supplies. It's not pitch black all the time, and for a few hours around midday, the skies turn these sort of soft shades of red, violet, and amber and gold for just a few glorious hours. It really does make for an incredible sight to see, but for the rest of the time, it's complete darkness outside. As you can imagine, people look to just about anything to raise their spirits, so I believe them when they say that Uncle Kimmick visits were celebrated. Kids would flock to pet the dogs, and shopkeepers would have his supply order set aside. Flour for palaga bread, ammunition to keep him safe, and tea to help keep him warm at night when the temperatures really dipped. He preferred the solitude of his isolated sod-roofed cabin that he kept warm with seal oil lamps, but sure loved those trips and would often stick around town for a few hours talking to folks after trading for his supplies. But then one day, in the late afternoon after the skies had gone dark again, Uncle Kimmick took off into the tundra again while waving everyone goodbye. But as he disappeared into the darkness, and with the light of his sled getting smaller and smaller, the people of Point Hope saw a lightning storm suddenly burst into life in front of them. It was my grandpa who told me the story, and not only did he claim to have witnessed that lightning storm with his own 2 eyes, he said it was the single eeriest thing he had ever seen. He wasn't the only one to see it. He spoke to plenty of older people who remembered that strange electrical storm, and the reason everyone remembered the storm as so strange was because of how silent it was. There was no greater gusts of wind and no thunderclaps after each fork of lightning struck, but that's actually very explainable, as thunder only tends to travel around 15 miles before the sound drops off. Everyone in town saw it as one of the many strange sights the far north has to offer, then went about their business as normal. About a week went by, and everyone was looking forward to Uncle Kimmick's return. They figured that he must be running low on the old firewater because everyone loves a drink when it's night all goddamn day. But Kimmick didn't show, and after 3 days of getting more and more worried about him, a group of volunteers went off into the tundra to go look for him. They wrapped up warm, gathered up their high-powered flashlights, and then after taking off on ski-doos and dog sleds of their own, they got about 10 miles before they found Uncle Kimmick's sled. The sled was lying on its side, the handrails all smashed up by something, and then his dog harness was empty too, with all 8 of them having been scattered to the winds. They're not tied or locked into the harness, so that wasn't all that shocking considering the sled itself had turned over, and at first, Uncle Kimmick was nowhere to be found. But then, maybe only 100 yards or so from where his turned-over sled was, they started finding pieces of his clothes all torn up. And then finally, they found him, or at least what was left of him anyway. The man's clothes had been shredded, but even so, there wasn't much left of him to cover up. The men who found him said it looked like he'd been eaten by a polar bear, one that had probably shared him with its cubs, but unless it happened to ambush him pretty good, which is real hard out there in the treeless tundra, then it wasn't a bear that got him. It must have been his dogs. Some of the other guys who found him said the damage to his skin and bones made it look like a frenzied and sustained attack from more than a couple of animals. But there was no confusing that till they found the escaped dogs and analyzed their droppings. The same group of volunteers went off searching for them, and with the dogs being hungry and staying as a very loud pack, it shouldn't have been all that hard to find them. But here's the kicker. Not a single one of old Uncle Kimmick's sled dogs was ever found. Not then, not in the future, not ever. After they found his body, people started connecting his death to the weird lightning storm that happened that night. People said it must have spooked his dogs and that he must have been right in the middle of that lightning storm when it came down, or at least close enough to the strikes that it scared the ever-living crap out of them. And that's the only reason people could believe Kimmick's sled dogs might attack him, that they must have been out of their minds with terror. But he loved those dogs like family, and everyone knew how much they loved him back. But even if Uncle Kimmick did get struck by lightning, which is what some folks believe, it'd take a whole lot of starving before his dogs saw fit to eat him, and they most definitely wouldn't have done it right away. But if that truly is the case, then what the hell happened out there? And what the hell happened to Uncle Kimmick's dogs? They never found any of their remains out there, and no one in any of the distant towns reported a pack of stray sled dogs running through their town. So then, where the hell did they go? No one ever did figure out what happened to old Uncle Kimmick, and in the years that followed, people were extra careful about where they traveled after dark and when, especially during the polar nights, when it seemed like something just might be lurking out there among the endless dark of the Alaskan tundra. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations, as I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. And there are super fun live streams every Sunday and Wednesday night. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon.